Single mother cares for paraplegic billionaire and discovers something life-changing. The bitter December wind howled through the grand corridors of the Wheeler estate as Emma Stanton rushed through the marble entrance, her heart pounding against her ribs. The morning had started routinely enough, her first day as a caregiver to the reclusive billionaire Thomas Wheeler. But when she pushed open the master bathroom door, following her instincts after minutes of unanswered calls, the scene before her shattered any semblance of routine. Thomas Wheeler sat in his wheelchair beside the bathtub, an empty bottle of pills scattered across the floor. His usually stern face was ashen, his piercing blue eyes unfocused. Without hesitation, Emma's fingers flew to his neck, finding a pulse weak but present. "Mr. Wheeler," her voice echoed off the cold tiles. "Stay with me." As she dialed 911 with trembling fingers, memories of another hospital room flashed through her mind. Her 5-year-old son Jake, pale and fragile, fighting for his life after heart surgery. The mysterious donor who had saved him. The crushing weight of helplessness. "Please," she whispered, gripping Thomas's limp hand. "I won't let you give up." His eyes flickered open briefly, meeting hers with a mix of confusion and something else, recognition, perhaps? Or was it destiny's cruel joke that she should find herself here, fighting to save the life of another soul lost in darkness? The sirens wailed in the distance, but Emma knew the real battle was just beginning. 3 years before that fateful morning at the Wheeler estate, Emma Stanton stood in the fluorescent-lit hallway of Queen's Memorial Hospital, clutching a medical bill that threatened to shatter her world. Jake, her precious 5-year-old son, lay in the pediatric ward, his tiny body connected to a maze of tubes and monitors. The congenital heart condition had been discovered during a routine checkup, and the required surgery costs were astronomical. At 32, Emma's life had become a delicate balancing act. The small diner where she worked as a waitress barely covered their modest apartment rent in Queens, let alone the mounting medical expenses. The morning shifts blended into evening doubles, her uniform perpetually smelling of grease despite countless washes. Her hands, once soft and manicured, now bore the calluses of endless hours carrying plates and wiping tables. But the tiny one-bedroom apartment they called home sat above a noisy bodega, its walls thin enough to hear the neighbors' arguments and the constant rumble of the elevated train. The ancient radiator wheezed more than it heated, forcing them to sleep with extra blankets during the harsh New York winters. But it was home, the only one Jake had ever known. Robert, Jake's father, had disappeared before their son's first birthday, leaving nothing but a hastily scribbled note and a stack of unpaid bills. Emma had learned to hide her tears behind bright smiles and bedtime stories, determined that Jake would never feel the weight of their circumstances. His childhood would be filled with love, even if their refrigerator wasn't always full. The memory of that hospital corridor still haunted her the moment when Dr. Sarah Marshall had explained the urgency of Jake's surgery. Emma had felt her world crumbling, the fluorescent light suddenly too bright, the antiseptic smell too sharp. How could she possibly raise the money? The insurance had denied their claim, citing a pre-existing condition clause. Then the miracle happened. An anonymous donor had covered the entire cost of Jake's surgery. Emma had collapsed into tears when the hospital administrator delivered the news, relief and gratitude overwhelming her. To this day, she didn't know the identity of their savior, but their kindness had changed everything. Post-surgery, Jake's recovery had been slow but steady. His resilience amazed the medical staff, the way he'd smile through the pain, how he'd insist on reading his favorite dinosaur books, even when exhausted. Emma had slept in the uncomfortable hospital chair for weeks, leaving only for her shifts at the diner, her body running on coffee and determination. The medical bills might have been covered, but the recovery period had drained their modest savings. Emma had taken out loans, maxed out credit cards, and picked up extra shifts whenever possible. The diner's owner, Martha, had been understanding, allowing Emma to adjust her schedule around Jake's appointments. But even Martha's kindness couldn't prevent the inevitable strain on their finances. Now, 3 years later, Emma watched Jake sleep in their small apartment, his chest rising and falling steadily. The surgical scar had faded to a thin line, but their financial scars ran deeper. The eviction notice tucked in her purse served as a cruel reminder of their precarious situation. The diner's closing had been the final blow. Martha's tearful announcement still echoed in her mind. That's when she'd seen the caregiving position advertised. The salary was triple what she made at the diner, and while she had no formal experience, she understood what it meant to care for someone in need. She'd done it every day for Jake. Looking at her sleeping son, his dark curls tousled against the pillow, Emma felt the familiar mix of love and determination surge through her. The Wheeler position was more than just a job, it was a chance to provide Jake with the stability he deserved, to finally get ahead of the bills that kept her awake at night, to maybe, just maybe, give him the childhood she'd always dreamed of providing. Tomorrow, she would start her new job at the Wheeler estate. The agency had warned her about Thomas Wheeler's difficult personality, his bitterness following the accident that had left him paralyzed. But Emma was no stranger to difficult circumstances. She had weathered storms before, and she would weather this one too. For Jake, she would face anything. 2 years before Emma entered his life, Thomas Wheeler stood at the pinnacle of success. Wheeler Innovations had grown from a modest engineering firm into a billion-dollar empire under his leadership. Business magazines featured his confident smile on their covers, praising his innovative approach to adaptive technology and his commitment to accessibility solutions. At 45, he had achieved what most people could only dream of: professional success, a loving family, and a legacy that would outlive him. The Wheeler building dominated the Manhattan skyline, its glass and steel architecture a testament to Thomas's vision. Inside his top-floor office, photographs told the story of a life well lived. Thomas teaching his 10-year-old son, Michael, to fish his wife Catherine's radiant smile at charity galas, family vacations at their lake house. Thomas had built his empire without sacrificing his family life, a balance he took immense pride in maintaining. Catherine had been his anchor since their college days at Yale. While he built the company, she devoted herself to their charitable foundation, focusing on medical research and accessibility programs. Michael inherited both his father's sharp mind and his mother's compassionate heart. Their family dinners were filled with laughter, debates about the latest technologies, and Michael's endless questions about how things worked. The helicopter was a recent purchase, meant to ease Thomas's commute between their Connecticut home and Manhattan office. Catherine had teased him about his midlife crisis toy, but supported his decision, as she always did. That fateful Sunday was supposed to be a family day trip to their lake house. The weather report showed clear skies. The maintenance logs were impeccable. Everything should have been perfect. The investigation would later reveal mechanical failure, but for Thomas the details didn't matter. One moment he was listening to Michael's excited chatter about his science project, the next there was a sickening lurch, the screech of metal, and then darkness. He woke up 2 weeks later to a world shattered beyond recognition. Catherine and Michael were gone. His legs would never move again. The empire he had built seemed meaningless in the face of such devastating loss. The press covered the tragedy extensively, the business titan brought low by cruel fate. Thomas retreated to his estate, shuttering himself away from the world that had taken everything from him. The board members whispered about his stability, his cousin Richard circled like a vulture, and one by one his friends learned to stop calling. The mansion that had once echoed with Michael's laughter became a mausoleum of memories. Thomas ordered Catherine's garden maintained exactly as she had left it, but he couldn't bear to look at it. Michael's room remained untouched, his half-finished science project still on the desk. The staff walked on eggshells, watching their once dynamic employer sink deeper into darkness. Physical therapy sessions became battlegrounds, with Thomas refusing to engage beyond the bare minimum. He fired 3 caregivers in the first month, their attempts at cheerfulness only fueling his rage. But the company ran on autopilot, with Thomas participating in board meetings via video call, his contributions becoming increasingly bitter and confrontational. Richard Blackwood, his cousin and board member, began suggesting that Thomas's condition made him unfit to lead. The whispers grew louder with each passing month. Wheeler Innovations needs strong leadership, Richard would say in board meetings, his concern masking darker ambitions. Thomas needs time to heal. The man who had once commanded rooms with his presence now sat in shadows, surrounded by photographs he couldn't bear to look at, but couldn't bring himself to remove. His razor-sharp business mind turned inward, focusing only on his losses. The media speculated about the future of Wheeler Innovations, while competitors circled, sensing weakness in the once unshakable company. In his darker moments, which came more frequently than not, Thomas wondered why he had survived when Catherine and Michael hadn't. The guilt ate at him. He had been piloting the helicopter. Their deaths were on his hands. The paralysis seemed like punishment, though not severe enough for the magnitude of his failure. The Wheeler estate became his self-imposed prison, its grand rooms and manicured grounds a daily reminder of everything he had lost. The staff whispered about his outbursts, his refusal to engage with the world, his increasing dependence on sleep medication. But no one dared to challenge him directly. After all, what could they say to a man who had lost not just his family, but his entire reason for living? When Margaret Peggy Thompson, his longtime housekeeper, suggested hiring another caregiver, Thomas had barely acknowledged her. What was the point? No one could fix what was broken. No one could bring back what he had lost. But Peggy persisted, and in his exhaustion he finally relented. Little did he know that the next caregiver would change everything. The Wheeler estate stood like a fortress on the outskirts of Greenwich, Connecticut, its iron gates and stone walls keeping the world at bay. The mansion, a masterpiece of modern architecture, rose from perfectly manicured grounds that sprawled over 10 acres. Floor-to-ceiling windows reflected the morning light, while inside the atmosphere remained perpetually dim, matching its owner's disposition. Peggy Thompson had served as head housekeeper for 15 years, watching the estate transform from a place of warmth and life to its current state of elegant desolation. Her domain was a staff of 12, each carefully selected and trained to maintain the precise standards Thomas Wheeler demanded. At 60, with her silver hair always perfectly coiffed and her navy uniform pressed to military precision, Peggy ran the household with quiet efficiency. The staff moved through their duties like ghosts, speaking in whispers and avoiding Thomas's study where he spent most of his days. The kitchen, once filled with the aroma of Catherine's baking experiments and Michael's after-school snacks, now produced meals that often went untouched. Sarah, the cook, still prepared Thomas's favorites, hoping to tempt his appetite, but most days the plates returned to the kitchen barely touched. Dr. Nathan Miller, known to everyone as Nate, visited 3 times a week for physical therapy sessions. At 35, with an easy smile and unshakable optimism, he was one of the few people who dared to challenge Thomas's moods. His attempts to engage Thomas beyond basic exercises were met with stony silence or sharp remarks, but Nate persisted with professional patience. The East Wing, where Catherine and Michael's rooms remained untouched, was strictly off-limits. Dust cloths covered the furniture, and the doors remained locked, though Peggy secretly entered once a month to ensure everything remained preserved. Michael's backpack still hung on its hook, his soccer cleats lined up beneath it. Catherine's reading glasses lay on her bedside table, a bookmark still holding her place in the novel she would never finish. The garden, visible from Thomas's study window, was maintained exactly as Catherine had designed it. The groundskeepers followed her detailed plans, preserving the seasonal rotations of blooms she had so carefully orchestrated. The stone bench where the family used to gather for weekend breakfast stood empty, its surface weathered by rain and memories. The staff break room, tucked away in the service wing, served as an unofficial command center. Here, Peggy coordinated the daily operations with military precision, assigning tasks and managing schedules through a complex system of color-coded charts. The room also functioned as a safe space for the staff to decompress, sharing whispered concerns about their employer's declining state. James, the elderly groundskeeper who had worked for the Wheelers for 2 decades, often spoke of the before-times weekend barbecues where Thomas manned the grill, Catherine's garden parties that brought the estate to life, Michael's birthday celebrations that filled the grounds with laughter. Now, the only sounds were the distant hum of maintenance equipment and the echo of wheels on hardwood floors. The garage housed a collection of luxury vehicles gathering dust, including Catherine's cherished vintage Mustang that Thomas couldn't bear to look at. The helicopter pad, visible from the main drive, had been decommissioned, its presence a stark reminder of the tragedy that had altered everything. Into this carefully maintained world of grief and routine, Emma Stanton would arrive, unknowingly setting in motion changes that would ripple through the estate's carefully constructed facades. Her arrival was met with mixed reactions from the staff, hope from Peggy, skepticism from others who had seen previous caregivers come and go. The morning of Emma's first day, Peggy gathered the staff for a brief meeting. "Miss Stanton starts today," she announced, her tone brooking no argument. "She's to be given every assistance in settling in. Mr. Wheeler needs this to work." The unspoken message was clear: this might be their last chance to help their employer find his way back to the land of the living. As Emma's car approached the gates that morning, the estate seemed to hold its breath. The garden sparkled with early frost, the windows reflected the rising sun, and somewhere inside, Thomas Wheeler sat in his study, unaware that his world was about to change forever. The first board meeting after Emma's arrival set the stage for the battles to come. From his home office, Thomas Wheeler connected virtually to the Wheeler Innovations boardroom, where 12 faces stared back at him through the screen. Richard Blackwood sat at the center, his perfectly tailored suit and practiced concern masking predatory ambition. "Quarterly profits are down 15%, Richard announced, his voice carrying the smooth polish of old money and Yale education. "The market is concerned about the company's direction, Thomas. Your condition has shareholders questioning your ability to lead effectively." The pause before condition carried volumes of calculated insult. Emma, standing discreetly in the background, watched Thomas's knuckles whiten on his armrests. The board meeting was her first glimpse into the corporate warfare threatening to strip everything from her employer. The other board members shifted uncomfortably, their loyalties clearly divided between the Wheeler they'd known and the future Richard promised. Richard's campaign had begun subtly enough: casual comments about Thomas's reduced involvement, gentle suggestions about temporary leadership changes. But over the past months his tactics had grown bolder. He'd started meeting privately with key shareholders, planting seeds of doubt about Thomas's mental state. The press had picked up the story, running speculative pieces about Wheeler Innovations' uncertain future. The financial pressure mounted daily. Stock prices fluctuated with each rumor about Thomas's capability to lead. Major clients began holding off on contract renewals, waiting to see how the power struggle would play out. Richard orchestrated each crisis masterfully, presenting himself as the voice of reason while systematically undermining his cousin's authority. "Perhaps," Richard suggested, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "it's time to consider a temporary transition of power. For your own good, Thomas. Focus on your recovery." The words hung in the air like poison. Thomas's response was ice cold. "My recovery is progressing fine, Richard. The company's direction remains clear," but Emma could see the toll the meeting took on him, the way his shoulders tensed with each veiled attack. Outside the virtual boardroom, other challenges multiplied. The media circled like vultures, running stories with headlines like "Wheeler Empire at Crossroads" and "Tragedy's Aftermath. Can Wheeler Innovation Survive?" Paparazzi lurked near the estate gates, hoping to catch glimpses of the reclusive CEO, their cameras ready to capture any sign of weakness. Long-time employees began jumping ship, lured away by competitors or scared off by the uncertainty. Richard made sure to publicize each departure as evidence of the company's instability under Thomas's leadership. Every resignation letter became ammunition in his campaign to seize control. The pressure affected the entire household. Peggy fielded constant calls from reporters and concerned business associates. Dr. Miller's therapy sessions grew tenser as Thomas pushed himself harder, determined to prove his capability. The staff walked on eggshells, aware that their own job security hung by a thread. Emma witnessed it all, understanding that her position was perhaps the most precarious. Previous caregivers had lasted weeks at most. Richard had already suggested that Thomas's revolving door of caregivers demonstrated his unstable mind. Each morning brought new uncertainty. Would this be the day Thomas's frustration boiled over? Would Richard finally succeed in his takeover attempt? The financial implications reached beyond the company. Thomas's personal fortune, while still substantial, faced new threats. Richard had begun questioning Thomas's personal expenses, including the cost of maintaining the estate and its staff. The suggestion that Thomas was no longer capable of managing his own finances hung unspoken but ever present. During one particularly heated exchange, Richard went for the jugular. "Catherine would want what's best for the company," he said, invoking Thomas's late wife's name like a weapon. Think about Michael's legacy. The mention of his lost family nearly broke Thomas's carefully maintained composure. But Emma, observing from her position by the door, saw something change in Thomas's eyes at that moment. Behind the anger and grief, a spark of the old fighter flickered to life. Richard had overplayed his hand, and in doing so he'd awakened something in Thomas that had been dormant since the accident. That evening, after the board meeting ended, Emma found Thomas still in his study, staring at the company reports. "He won't stop," Thomas said quietly, more to himself than to her. "Not until he has everything." It was the first time he'd acknowledged the true scope of the threat they faced. The battle lines were drawn. Richard Blackwood, backed by uncertain board members and circling media, positioned himself as the company's savior. Thomas Wheeler, wounded but not defeated, faced the fight of his life. And Emma Stanton, the unlikely caregiver, found herself drawn into a corporate war that would test not just her job security, but her growing loyalty to the broken man she'd been hired to help. Behind the corporate battleground, deeper struggles played out within the walls of the Wheeler estate. Thomas Wheeler's depression manifested in ways that challenged Emma's every attempt at care. Some mornings he refused to leave his bed, staring at the ceiling with vacant eyes that seemed to look straight through her. Other days his anger erupted over the smallest things: water too hot, curtains drawn incorrectly, silence too loud. "Leave it," he snapped one morning when Emma attempted to adjust his pillows. "I don't need your constant hovering." His words carried the sharp edge of a man fighting not just physical limitations, but the demons of guilt and grief that haunted his every waking moment. The nights were worst. Emma often heard him wheeling through the darkened halls during her overnight shifts, his insomnia driving him to roam like a ghost in his own home. Sometimes she'd find him in Michael's room, though he'd forbidden anyone else from entering. He never acknowledged her presence during these moments, lost in memories she couldn't share. Pain medication became a point of contention. Dr. Miller had prescribed a careful regimen, but Thomas often refused the pills, as if embracing the physical pain could somehow atone for surviving. "You don't understand," he told Emma during one particularly difficult evening. "I don't deserve relief. I was flying. I was responsible." For Emma, balancing her commitment to Thomas's care with her responsibilities as a mother became an increasingly complex dance. Jake's school called regularly. He was struggling to adjust to their new schedule, acting out in class, missing his mother. The babysitter's fees ate into Emma's salary, and the long hours at the estate meant missing school events and bedtime stories. "When are you coming home?" Mama Jake would ask during their nightly phone calls, his small voice making her heart ache. "I miss you," Emma would hold back tears, promising to make it up to him, knowing she was failing at the one job that mattered most. The physical demands of caring for Thomas took their toll. Emma's back ached from helping with transfers, her sleep was interrupted by emergency calls, and meals became irregular catches between crises. Dark circles formed under her eyes, and her clothes began to hang looser on her frame. Thomas noticed, though he rarely commented directly. One morning, watching her stifle a yawn, he said, "You look exhausted, Miss Stanton. Perhaps this job is too much for you." His tone suggested both criticism and something else concern, perhaps, though he'd never admit it. The isolation of the estate weighed heavily on both of them. Thomas refused visitors, conducting all business virtually. Emma's social life dwindled to brief phone calls with former co-workers and hurried conversations with Jake's teachers. The vast mansion, for all its grandeur, began to feel like a beautiful prison. Depression crept in at unexpected moments. Emma would find Thomas staring at old family photographs, his fingers tracing the faces of his lost loved ones. During therapy sessions, he'd push himself to exhaustion, as if physical pain could drown out emotional agony. His appetite waned, meals returning to the kitchen barely touched. "Why do you stay?" he asked her one evening, after a particularly difficult day. "Others have quit for less." Emma had no simple answer. How could she explain that his struggle had become intertwined with her own? That somehow, in helping him fight his demons, she was fighting her own? Jake's teacher suggested counseling, concerned about his withdrawal at school. "He needs stability," the counselor advised during a rushed phone consultation. "Children his age require consistent parental presence." The words felt like accusations, adding to Emma's growing mountain of guilt. Sleep became a luxury Emma couldn't afford. When she wasn't physically caring for Thomas, she was catching up on Jake's homework over the phone, coordinating with teachers, or trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy in their disrupted lives. The weight of responsibility to her son, to Thomas, to herself threatened to crush her. Thomas's own battles intensified. His refusal to fully engage with physical therapy hindered his progress. Pride prevented him from accepting help with tasks he could barely manage alone. Each small defeat fed his conviction that he'd lost not just his family, but his very identity. "I used to build things," he told Emma during a rare moment of openness. "I used to create, lead, make decisions that mattered. Now I can't even dress myself without help." The bitterness in his voice reflected not just physical limitations, but a deeper loss of purpose. These internal struggles created a complex web of dependency and resistance. Thomas needed Emma's care but fought against accepting it. Emma needed the job but struggled with its costs to her family life. Both were trapped in patterns of loss and duty, neither able to find a clear path forward. Yet somehow, in their shared battles with depression, guilt, and exhaustion, a fragile understanding began to form. They were two broken people, each fighting their own wars while trying to navigate the battlefield of daily survival. The staff dynamics at the Wheeler estate resembled a delicate chess game, with alliances and tensions shifting like pieces on an invisible board. The arrival of Emma added a new element to an already complex situation, disrupting established patterns and forcing everyone to recalibrate their positions. In the kitchen, Sarah, the cook who had served the Wheelers for 12 years, maintained her own sphere of influence. She viewed Emma with guarded suspicion, remembering the parade of previous caregivers who had come and gone. "Don't get too comfortable," she warned Emma during her first week. "This place has a way of breaking people." Yet Sarah's actions betrayed a deeper concern. She began preparing Emma's favorite coffee without being asked, leaving small plates of food when she worked late shifts. David Anderson, the estate manager, aligned himself firmly with Richard Blackwood's camp. His weekly reports to the board subtly undermined Thomas's authority, documenting every missed meeting and medication refusal. He watched Emma's interactions with Thomas carefully, looking for ammunition to support Richard's claims about Thomas's instability. Peggy Thompson stood as Emma's strongest ally, recognizing in the new caregiver a determination that matched her own. "This house needs healing," she told Emma privately. "And you, my dear, might be exactly what we've been waiting for." Her support proved invaluable, smoothing over conflicts with other staff members and providing guidance through the estate's unwritten rules. The night staff, led by Marcus Wells, operated in their own isolated world. They witnessed Thomas's nocturnal wanderings, his sleepless nights spent in his study or Michael's room. Their loyalty to Thomas ran deep, having seen him at his most vulnerable, but they remained wary of Emma's growing influence. Dr. Miller navigated the political waters with professional detachment, though his frustration with the situation occasionally showed. "The staff's divided loyalties aren't helping his recovery," he confided to Emma after a particularly difficult therapy session. "He needs a united front, not a house full of spies and whispers." The younger staff members formed their own faction, trading gossip and speculation about Thomas's condition and Emma's role. They monitored Richard's visits with keen interest, placing bets on how long Emma would last, debating whether Thomas would ever recover his former position. Emma found herself walking an increasingly narrow line. Each interaction was scrutinized, every decision questioned. When she adjusted Thomas's schedule to accommodate longer therapy sessions, David immediately reported it to the board as evidence of disruption. When she succeeded in getting Thomas to eat regular meals, Sarah viewed it as criticism of her previous efforts. The security team, headed by former police officer Frank Morrison, maintained strict professional distance but quietly supported Emma's efforts. They noticed how Thomas's mood improved, however slightly, under her care. Frank began ensuring Emma's late-night shifts were more comfortable, having coffee ready when she arrived, keeping her informed of any unusual activity. Divisions deepened as Thomas showed small signs of improvement. Those loyal to Richard saw Emma's influence as a threat to their plans. Others, remembering the estate's happier days, dared to hope for real change. The staff break room became a battleground of whispered arguments and pointed silences. Peggy worked tirelessly to maintain order, but even her authority had limits. "This house is like a powder keg," she admitted to Emma one evening. "Everyone's waiting to see which spark will set it off." The gardeners, who had maintained Catherine's beloved gardens through all the changes, formed their own quiet resistance to Richard's influence. They reported to Emma when Richard's car was spotted near the estate, giving her time to prepare Thomas for unwanted confrontations. Through it all, Emma learned to read the subtle signs of alliance and opposition. A cleaned wheelchair meant Marcus approved of her methods. A delayed meal delivery signaled Sarah's displeasure. A maintenance issue quickly resolved indicated Frank's support. Each day brought new lessons in estate politics. The staff's children, who occasionally visited during school holidays, provided an unexpected bridge. They took to Jake immediately when he visited, and their acceptance helped soften some of the adult resistance to Emma's presence. Even Sarah melted slightly when she saw Jake helping in the kitchen, remembering Michael's similar enthusiasm for cooking. As winter deepened, the estate's political landscape continued to evolve. Emma's position remained precarious, but her quiet persistence began to earn reluctant respect, even from her critics. The battle lines remained drawn, but the nature of the war was changing, becoming less about Thomas's leadership and more about the very soul of the Wheeler estate. The rhythm of daily life at the Wheeler estate began to take shape, marked by small victories and quiet setbacks. Emma learned to read Thomas's moods in the subtle changes of his expression, in the way he held his shoulders, in the depth of silence that greeted her morning arrivals. The breakthroughs came unexpectedly. One morning, after weeks of leaving his breakfast untouched, Thomas actually smiled at the coffee Emma prepared, a precise mixture of dark roast with just a splash of cream, exactly as Catherine used to make it. He didn't comment, but the empty cup spoke volumes. "You're getting better at this," he remarked one day, as she helped him with his physical therapy exercises. The words were casual, almost throwaway, but they marked the first direct acknowledgement of her efforts. Emma kept her voice steady, hiding how much the simple praise meant. "Practice makes perfect, Mr. Wheeler." The setbacks were equally unpredictable. A photograph knocked askew during cleaning could trigger hours of stony silence. The sound of children playing in a neighbor's yard sometimes sent him into a dark mood that lasted days. Emma learned to weather these storms with quiet patience, understanding that grief followed no logical pattern. And their morning routine evolved into a careful dance. Emma would arrive at precisely 7 a.m., opening the curtains to let in the dawn light. Thomas pretended to be annoyed by her punctuality, but she caught him checking his watch, expecting her arrival. They developed an unspoken language, the tilt of his head when he needed help but couldn't ask, the way she positioned herself just close enough to assist without hovering. "Do you ever get tired of this?" he asked her one evening, after a particularly challenging day. The constant caretaking, the responsibility. Emma met his gaze steadily. "Do you ever get tired of needing it?" Her honesty surprised them both, but it marked a shift in their dynamic. They were no longer just caregiver and patient, but two people acknowledging the complexity of their situation. Physical therapy sessions became a battleground of determination versus pride. Dr. Miller pushed Thomas to his limits, while Emma stood ready to support but not coddle. She learned when to step in and when to step back, reading the fine line between assistance and enablement. The wheelchair became less of a barrier as Emma mastered its nuances. She learned the exact angle needed to navigate the estate's doorways, the precise pressure required to brake smoothly. Thomas noticed her growing competence but said nothing, though his grip on the armrests gradually relaxed when she took control. Their conversations, initially limited to necessary exchanges, began to expand. Thomas discovered Emma's quick wit matched his own dry humor. She found he could be surprisingly insightful when he chose to engage. They developed inside jokes about the staff's quirks, sharing knowing looks during particularly formal dinner services. The nights remained the hardest. Thomas's insomnia often led to late-night conversations that walked the edge of vulnerability. In the darkness, he sometimes spoke of Catherine and Michael, sharing fragments of memories he couldn't face in daylight. Emma listened without judgment, understanding that healing sometimes meant simply bearing witness to another's pain. Small changes marked their progress. Thomas began joining the staff for meals occasionally, though he spoke little. He allowed Emma to rearrange his study for better accessibility, a task that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier. She learned to anticipate his needs without making him feel helpless, a delicate balance that took constant adjustment. Their failures became learning opportunities. When Thomas struggled with a new therapy exercise, Emma shared stories of Jake's determination during his recovery. When she miscalculated a transfer and nearly dropped him, his frustrated anger gave way to reluctant appreciation for her immediate apology and correction. Weather became their mutual enemy and ally. Rainy days left Thomas's joints aching and his mood dark, but they also forced them to find new ways to pass time indoors. Emma introduced audiobooks when his hands were too stiff to hold physical volumes. They developed a competitive streak over crossword puzzles, each taking pride in solving particularly difficult clues. The garden, visible from Thomas's study window, became a marker of their progress. Initially, he couldn't bear to look at Catherine's carefully planned flower beds. Gradually, with Emma's subtle encouragement, he began to notice the changing seasons, even commenting occasionally on the gardener's work. Through it all, they maintained a professional distance that nonetheless allowed for growing understanding. Emma never presumed familiarity, always addressing him as Mr. Wheeler, yet she learned to read volumes in his silences. Thomas kept his emotional walls high, but small cracks appeared, a grateful nod here, a shared joke there. These daily interactions, seemingly insignificant in isolation, began to weave a stronger connection between them. It wasn't friendship exactly, nor was it simply a professional relationship. It was something unique to their circumstances, a partnership forged in shared struggles and small triumphs, built on constant adjustments and growing trust. The first time Jake visited the Wheeler estate was unplanned, a last-minute childcare emergency that forced Emma to bring him to work. She had expected Thomas's anger, perhaps even dismissal, but instead found something entirely unexpected: silence followed by curiosity. 5-year-old Jake, with his unruly dark curls and perpetual smile, stood in the grand foyer, eyes wide with wonder. "This is like a castle, Mama," his voice echoed through the usually quiet halls. Emma held her breath, waiting for Thomas's reaction. But when she looked over, she caught him watching the boy with an expression she'd never seen before, a softening around his eyes, a slight tremor in his hands. "He has Michael's energy," Thomas said later that evening, so quietly Emma almost missed it. It was the first time he'd spoken his son's name without visible pain. But Jake had spent the day drawing pictures in Emma's office, occasionally wandering into view. His innocent questions about the wheelchair met with unexpected patience from Thomas. After that first visit, Jake's presence became a subtle catalyst for change. Emma began finding reasons to bring him more often: school holidays, early dismissals, the occasional weekend shift. Each time, the atmosphere in the mansion shifted, as if the simple presence of a child's laughter could temporarily lift the weight of grief that hung over the estate. "Mr. Wheeler, why do you have so many books?" Jake would ask. "Or can I show you my dinosaur drawings?" His questions, uncomplicated by adult hesitation, often received answers when Emma's careful inquiries met with stony silence. Thomas found himself explaining things to Jake that he hadn't discussed in years: how the stock market worked, why the gardens were designed in certain ways, stories about building his company. The staff noticed the change. Peggy would find excuses to bring cookies when Jake visited, and even Sarah, the usually stern cook, softened around him. "He reminds me of young Master Michael," she confided to Emma one afternoon, watching Jake help fold napkins for dinner. Same kind heart. During one visit, Jake discovered Michael's old model airplane collection preserved in the study. Instead of the expected withdrawal, Thomas surprised everyone by showing Jake how the models worked, his voice growing animated as he explained the mechanics. Emma watched from the doorway, tears threatening, as she observed this glimpse of the father Thomas had once been. "Can I come back tomorrow?" Jake would ask at the end of each visit, and though the answer was usually no, Thomas's expression suggested he wished otherwise. The boy's innocent acceptance of Thomas's condition, neither pitying nor afraid, seemed to ease something in the older man's rigid defenses. The changes were subtle but significant. Thomas began keeping a drawer of art supplies in his study, just in case Jake visited. He started asking about Jake's school progress, showing genuine interest in the boy's adventures and challenges. Emma noticed him watching father-son moments in the garden next door with longing rather than bitterness. One rainy afternoon, Jake was sitting on the floor of Thomas's study, working on homework, when he casually asked, "Do you miss your little boy?" The room froze. Emma started to intervene, but Thomas held up a hand, his voice rough but steady as he replied, "Every day, Jake, every single day." It was the most honest answer he'd given anyone about Michael since the accident. Jake's own history with illness and recovery resonated with Thomas in unexpected ways. Hearing about the boy's heart surgery and subsequent resilience stirred something in him. "Children are stronger than we think," he remarked to Emma one evening after Jake had gone home. "Sometimes stronger than adults." The wheelchair, which had been a symbol of shame and limitation for Thomas, became an object of fascination for Jake. "Can I ride on your lap?" he asked one day, causing Emma's heart to stop. But Thomas, after a long moment, nodded. Their slow circuit around the garden, Jake chattering excitedly about the speed and turns, brought the first genuine smile Emma had seen on Thomas's face. During physical therapy sessions, Jake would sometimes act as cheerleader, counting repetitions and offering enthusiastic encouragement. Dr. Miller noted that Thomas pushed himself harder on these days, as if somehow the presence of this small boy made him want to be stronger, better. Even Richard's occasional visits were affected by Jake's presence. The boy's innocent questions about why the mean man looked so angry made it harder for Richard to maintain his smooth facade of concern. Thomas's barely concealed amusement at these moments showed a spark of his old spirit. As winter turned to spring, Jake's influence on the household became undeniable. His drawings appeared on Thomas's study walls, his forgotten toys created moments of bittersweet discovery, and his unconditional acceptance began to heal wounds that professional care couldn't touch. In helping Thomas remember how to interact with a child again, Jake was unknowingly helping him remember how to live. The transformation within the Wheeler estate happened gradually, like ice thawing in spring. The staff, who had grown accustomed to operating in tense silence, began to notice subtle shifts in the household's atmosphere. It started with small changes, Thomas joining them for meals more frequently, brief conversations in hallways, moments of shared laughter drifting from his study. Peggy Thompson observed it all with quiet satisfaction. Her morning staff meetings, once exercises in damage control, evolved into more hopeful discussions. "Mr. Wheeler has requested to review the garden plans," she announced one morning, watching the ripple of surprise move through the assembled staff. "He'd like to restore Mrs. Wheeler's rose garden." Sarah, the cook who had initially viewed Emma with suspicion, found herself preparing special meals again. He asked for Catherine's old recipes she confided to Emma one evening, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "First time since." Well, you know, the kitchen, which had been merely functional for so long, began to fill again with the aromas of carefully crafted dishes. Dr. Miller's reports became increasingly positive. "The physical progress is remarkable," he told Emma during one of their weekly consultations, "but it's the mental shift that's truly extraordinary. He's engaging, asking questions, setting goals. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." The security team, led by Frank Morrison, noticed Thomas venturing outside more often. They adjusted their routines accordingly, discreetly ensuring his privacy while maintaining protection. Frank himself began leaving detailed reports about the garden's progress on Thomas's desk, knowing he now cared enough to read them. Even David Anderson, who had aligned himself with Richard's interests, found his position becoming increasingly uncomfortable. The weekly reports he sent to the board could no longer ignore the positive changes. Mr. Wheeler participated in all scheduled meetings, he wrote stiffly. "Staff morale has improved significantly." The younger staff members, who had once placed bets on Emma's departure date, now sought her advice on interacting with Thomas. They learned to read his moods, to anticipate his needs without hovering, to treat him with respect rather than pity. The whispered conversations in corners became more focused on his progress than his limitations. Marcus, the night supervisor, reported fewer sleepless wanderings. "He's actually sleeping through most nights now," he told Peggy during their shift change meetings. "And when he is awake, he's working on projects, not just existing." The ghost-like figure that had haunted the mansion's corridors was slowly being replaced by someone more substantial. The gardeners, who had maintained Catherine's beloved spaces with mechanical precision, found renewed purpose in Thomas's renewed interest. They began leaving small bouquets from the greenhouse in his study, a practice Catherine had always insisted upon. The first time Thomas commented on an arrangement, the head gardener had to step away to compose himself. Professional boundaries remained, but they softened around the edges. Staff members no longer fled when Thomas approached. Conversations didn't halt mid-sentence at his appearance. A more natural rhythm developed, reminiscent of the estate's happier days. Emma watched these changes with quiet pride, understanding that each small shift represented a victory over grief and isolation. She noticed how Peggy now smiled more readily, how Sarah hummed while cooking, how Dr. Miller's therapy sessions included genuine laughter. The staff's loyalty, which had been divided between Thomas and Richard's influence, began to solidify behind their recovering employer. Richard's visits were met with increasingly cool professionalism, his attempts to gather information about Thomas's condition politely but firmly deflected. During one particularly meaningful morning meeting, Peggy addressed the staff with barely contained emotion. "What we're witnessing," she said, her voice steady but her eyes bright, "is more than recovery. It's resurrection. Each of you has played a part in this, and each of you should be proud." The estate itself seemed to respond to the changing atmosphere. Rooms that had been closed off were reopened and aired. The heavy curtains that had kept out sunlight were drawn back. Music occasionally drifted from Thomas's study, classical pieces that Catherine had loved. As spring approached, the staff began to talk about the future with hope rather than resignation. Plans were made for garden parties, charitable events, community engagements, activities that had been unthinkable months before. The estate was awakening from its long winter of grief, and its staff awakened with it. The idea emerged from an unexpected moment of frustration. Thomas had been struggling with his wheelchair during a therapy session, the clunky device catching on the study's thick carpet. "There has to be a better way," he muttered, more to himself than to Emma or Dr. Miller. But that simple comment sparked something in his eyes, a glimmer of the innovator he'd once been. That evening, Emma found him at his desk, surrounded by sketches and technical drawings. His hands, which had been so idle for months, moved across the paper with renewed purpose. The initial designs were rough, born from his personal experience with the limitations of current wheelchair technology. "Look at this," he called to Emma the next morning, spreading out a detailed drawing. "The current models are built for function, not life. They're heavy, difficult to maneuver, impossible to customize." His voice carried an enthusiasm she hadn't heard before. But what if we could change that? The project consumed him. Thomas spent hours researching materials, studying ergonomics, consulting with engineering teams via video conference. His study transformed into a design laboratory, walls covered with drawings and specifications. But Emma watched as he came alive in the process, his mind engaging with problems he could solve rather than dwelling on those he couldn't. "It needs to be lightweight but durable," he explained to Dr. Miller during a therapy session. "Something that can adapt to different environments, different needs." The therapist listened intently, offering insights from his years of experience with patients. "The psychological impact of equipment design is often overlooked," Dr. Miller noted. "Your personal experience could make all the difference." Emma observed the change in Thomas as he worked. The man who had been drowning in grief found purpose in creation. He began sleeping better, eating regularly, engaging more fully in his therapy. The project gave him a reason to push through his limitations rather than surrender to them. The board meetings took on a different tone. Instead of defensive responses to Richard's challenges, Thomas presented vision and strategy. Wheeler Innovations started with the goal of improving lives, he reminded them. "This project returns us to our roots." Even Richard struggled to dismiss the passion and clarity in Thomas's presentations. Late one evening, Emma found Thomas staring at a photograph of Michael. "He would have loved this," Thomas said softly. He was always asking how things worked, how they could be made better. It was the first time he'd spoken of Michael with more joy than pain. The prototype development faced numerous challenges. Initial designs proved too costly, materials didn't perform as expected, and technical obstacles seemed insurmountable at times. But Thomas approached each setback with determined patience, a stark contrast to his previous pattern of withdrawal and defeat. Jake became an unexpected consultant, his innocent questions often leading to important insights. "Why can't it have colors?" he asked one day, studying the designs. "My friend Tommy at school says his dad's wheelchair is boring." Thomas spent the next 3 days incorporating customization options into the specs. But the staff watched the project's evolution with growing excitement. Peggy ensured Thomas had everything he needed for late-night work sessions. Sarah prepared brain-boosting meals without being asked. Even David Anderson had to admit in his reports that Thomas was showing remarkable leadership and innovation. Emma found herself deeply invested in the project's success. She spent hours helping Thomas organize research, arrange meetings, and refine presentations. More than once, she caught him watching her with a puzzled expression, as if surprised by her level of commitment. "Why do you care so much about this?" he asked her one evening as they reviewed supplier proposals. Emma considered her answer carefully. "Because it matters," she replied simply. "Because it could help people. Because it could help people. Because it's helping you." Thomas held her gaze for a long moment before nodding slightly. The project began attracting attention beyond the boardroom. Industry experts expressed interest, potential investors requested meetings, and media speculation turned positive. Richard's attempts to question Thomas's capability faced increasing skepticism as evidence of his renewed engagement mounted. Dr. Miller incorporated project goals into therapy sessions, pushing Thomas to strengthen the skills he'd need for hands-on development work. "You're not just designing for others," he reminded Thomas. "You're designing for yourself too." One morning, reviewing the latest prototype specs, Thomas made a quiet admission. "I never thought I'd create anything again," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "After the accident, it felt like that part of me died with Catherine and Michael." Emma waited, sensing he wasn't finished. "But maybe they'd want this. Maybe this is how I honor them." The wheelchair project became more than just a business venture or personal challenge. It represented Thomas's journey from darkness back into light, from isolation back into purpose. Each design improvement, each solved problem, each small victory helped rebuild not just a better wheelchair, but a better future. The crisis began during a routine afternoon at the Wheeler estate. Emma was helping Thomas with prototype documentation when her cell phone rang Jake's school nurse. Her son had collapsed during recess, complaining of chest pain. The world seemed to stop as Emma listened to the details, her face draining of color. "Go," Thomas said immediately, recognizing the fear in her eyes. "Take my car and drive her." It was the first time he'd offered such personal assistance, but Emma barely registered the significance as she rushed out. The familiar drive to Queen's General Hospital became an endless journey of terror and memories. Jake lay small and pale in the emergency room bed, connected to monitors that beeped with haunting familiarity. Dr. Sarah Marshall, who had performed his original surgery, arrived quickly. "His heart rhythm is irregular," she explained gently. "We need to run tests to determine if there's been any compromise to the previous repair." Thomas watched the Wheeler estate's security footage that evening, seeing Emma's hasty departure replayed on the screen. Something about her expression, the raw fear in her movements, stirred memories of his own parental terror. Without fully understanding why, he found himself making calls to the hospital's administrative office. "Mr. Wheeler," Peggy said softly, entering his study late that night. "The hospital reports that Jake is stable but requires observation." "Emma." "She's alone there," the unspoken question hung in the air. Thomas sat in silence for a long moment before reaching for his phone. "Get the car ready." The night shift at Queen's General wasn't prepared for the arrival of Thomas Wheeler. He wheeled himself through the fluorescent-lit corridors, Peggy following discreetly behind, until he found Emma curled in an uncomfortable waiting room chair, her face marked with dried tears. "Mr. Wheeler," Emma straightened, confusion mixing with exhaustion. "You shouldn't be here, the estate." "The estate can manage without me for one night," he cut her off, positioning his wheelchair beside her chair. "Tell me what the doctors said." As Emma explained Jake's condition, Thomas listened with unexpected intensity. He asked detailed questions about the previous surgery, the current symptoms, the proposed treatments. His business acumen turned toward understanding medical procedures and potential outcomes. During a quiet moment, while Jake slept and Emma dozed in her chair, Thomas studied the boy's peaceful face. He saw traces of Michael in Jake's features, not physical similarities, but the same fighting spirit, the same quiet bravery in the face of adult fears. Dawn broke with cautiously good news. The tests showed no major complications, though Jake would need adjusted medication and closer monitoring. As relief flooded Emma's face, Thomas made another call. By the time Dr. Marshall arrived for morning rounds, a pediatric cardiac specialist was being flown in for consultation. "I don't understand," Emma said when she learned of the specialist's arrival. "The hospital said the insurance wouldn't cover." "Wheeler Innovations has certain medical research interests," Thomas replied, not meeting her eyes. "Consider it a professional courtesy." The specialist confirmed Dr. Marshall's treatment plan, but suggested additional preventative measures. As he listed recommendations, Thomas took notes with the same attention he gave to board meetings. Emma watched him, seeing a different side of her employer emerge, not the bitter recluse or the driven inventor, but something entirely new. That afternoon, as Jake's color improved and his smile returned, Thomas revealed something unexpected. "I was the one," he said quietly, watching Jake chat with a nurse. 3 years ago, I received a letter from this hospital about a child needing emergency cardiac surgery. The details, they reminded me of health challenges Michael faced as an infant. I had my foundation cover the costs." Emma's world tilted on its axis. You were the anonymous donor," her voice cracked. "You saved my son's life before you even knew us." Thomas's hands gripped his wheelchair's arms tightly. "I couldn't save my own son," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "but I could help another child have a chance." The revelation changed something fundamental between them. As Jake recovered enough to return home, Emma saw Thomas through new eyes, not just as her employer or as a man fighting his own battles, but as someone whose capacity for kindness had survived unimaginable loss. Before they left the hospital, Jake asked Thomas to sign his get well card. "You're like a superhero," Jake declared sleepily. "But instead of a cape, you have a cool wheelchair." Thomas's laugh, surprised and genuine, echoed through the hospital room, the first real laugh Emma had heard from him since starting work at the estate. The drive back to Queens was quiet, both Emma and Thomas lost in their own thoughts. But something had shifted, a new understanding forming between them, built on shared fears, mutual gratitude, and the profound connection of parents who would do anything to protect their children. The days following Jake's hospital stay brought subtle but significant changes to the Wheeler estate. Thomas's revelation about his role in Jake's past surgery created an unspoken bond that neither he nor Emma quite knew how to address. The usual professional boundaries began to blur, replaced by something deeper and more complex. One evening, as Emma organized medical records in Thomas's study, she found him staring at an old photograph of Michael in a hospital bed, small but smiling, with Catherine holding his hand. Without prompting, Thomas began to speak. "Michael was born with a heart murmur," he said quietly, his fingers tracing the frame. "The doctors said he might not make it through his first year. Catherine and I spent months in and out of hospitals, watching him fight." His voice, usually so controlled, trembled slightly. "When he survived, we promised to help other families facing similar battles." Emma sat down slowly, recognizing the rarity of this moment. Thomas had never spoken so openly about his family before. "That's why you helped Jake," she said softly. "You understood what it meant." Watching Jake in that hospital bed, Thomas continued, "Seeing your fear. It was like looking into a mirror from the past. But this time I could do something besides just watch and pray." He set the photograph down carefully. "Michael would have liked Jake. They share the same spirit." The confession seemed to break something loose in Thomas. He spoke of Catherine's dedication during Michael's illness, how she'd turned their experience into a mission to help others. He remembered Michael's recovery, his determination to make up for lost time, his endless curiosity about the world. "I stopped the Foundation's work after the accident," he admitted, shame coloring his voice. "I couldn't bear to think about sick children. about parents facing the same fears we once did. It felt like a betrayal of their memory, but maybe I was the one betraying what they stood for. Emma listened, understanding that this wasn't just about the past. It was about finding a way forward, about honoring memories without being paralyzed by them. They would be proud, she said gently, of what you're doing now. The wheelchair project, helping Jake, you're still making a difference. Thomas turned to look out the window, where the garden Catherine had loved so much was showing signs of spring. I've been so angry, he confessed. At the world, at myself, at God. I survived when they didn't. What right did I have to keep living when they couldn't? The same right Jake had, Emma replied quietly. The same right anyone has who's given a second chance, to make it mean something. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken emotions. Then, to Emma's surprise, Thomas wheeled himself to his desk and pulled out a thick folder. Catherine's charitable foundation proposals, he explained. She had plans for a nationwide network of family support programs for children with medical needs. I shut it down after, but maybe it's time to revisit her vision. Over the next few hours, they pored over Catherine's notes together. Her passion jumped off the page's detailed plans for support groups, housing assistance, medical coordination. Thomas spoke of her dedication, his voice growing stronger as he remembered not just what he'd lost, but what she'd stood for. I've been preserving everything exactly as they left it, he said, gesturing to the mansion around them. The gardens, Michael's room, Catherine's projects, all frozen in time. But they never stood still in life. They were always moving forward, always looking for ways to help others. Emma watched as Thomas straightened in his wheelchair, purpose replacing pain in his expression. The foundation needs to be reactivated, he declared, and expanded, not just medical assistance, but comprehensive family support. Transportation, housing, counseling, everything we wished we'd had during Michael's illness, everything you needed during Jake's surgery. The transformation was remarkable. As Thomas outlined his plans, Emma saw glimpses of the man he must have been before the accident, passionate, driven, focused on creating positive change. His grief wasn't gone, but it was no longer the only thing defining him. As night fell over the estate, Thomas made one final confession. I've been existing in a tomb of memories, he said, his voice rough with emotion. But memories aren't meant to trap us. They're meant to guide us forward. Emma squeezed his shoulder gently, a gesture that would have been unthinkable weeks before. Then let's move forward, she said simply, one day at a time. The study fell quiet, but it was a different kind of silence than before. Not the heavy silence of grief, but the peaceful quiet of healing beginning to take hold. Richard Blackwood launched his most devastating attack during the quarterly board meeting, timing it perfectly to coincide with Thomas's presentation of the wheelchair project and foundation revival plans. The boardroom's virtual screen displayed the faces of 12 board members, each one carefully neutral as Richard rose to speak. While my cousin's recent projects are admirable, Richard began, his voice dripping with false concern, they raised serious questions about his judgment and stability. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. We've obtained psychiatric evaluations suggesting that Thomas is engaging in compulsive behavior, attempting to recreate his lost family through his new caregiver and her son. Emma, standing quietly behind Thomas's wheelchair, felt him stiffen. The accusation was carefully crafted to hit where it would hurt most: Thomas's relationship with Jake, his renewed interest in Catherine's foundation, his gradual emergence from grief. Furthermore, Richard continued, producing a stack of documents. Financial records show concerning patterns: unauthorized medical consultations, personal use of company resources, emotional decisions that put shareholder value at risk. He distributed the papers electronically, watching as board members scrolled through them with growing concern. Thomas's hands gripped his wheelchair arms so tightly his knuckles turned white. These allegations are baseless, he stated, his voice steady despite the visible tension in his shoulders. The wheelchair project has already attracted significant investor interest, and the Foundation's revival fulfills our company's original mission. Richard's smile was predatory. Ah, yes, the wheelchair project. A personal obsession that's draining company resources. And this mysterious caregiver. He gestured toward Emma, who seems to have an unusual influence over both our CEO and company decisions. The board should be aware that Miss Stanton has a history of financial difficulties and suspicious medical donations. The attack was comprehensive, targeting not just Thomas's leadership but attempting to destroy the fragile new purpose he'd found. Richard had done his homework, twisting every positive development into evidence of instability. "We've prepared a motion," Richard announced, "to temporarily transfer executive control to a management committee while Thomas receives the help he clearly needs." The suggestion was presented with such seeming compassion that several board members nodded sympathetically. But Richard had miscalculated. The months of healing and renewed purpose had given Thomas strength he didn't know he possessed. "Before you vote," Thomas said quietly, "I'd like to share something." He pressed a button, and new documents appeared on everyone's screens. These are the preliminary market analyses for the wheelchair project, including interest from 3 major healthcare providers. And this. Another document appeared is the impact report from the Foundation's original work, showing millions of dollars saved in healthcare costs while improving countless lives. Thomas's voice grew stronger as he continued. Richard speaks of stability in judgment. Let's examine his own record. More documents appeared, these showing a pattern of questionable decisions and self-dealing that Richard had tried to hide. While I focused on innovation and social impact, my cousin focused on personal profit at company expense. The board members' expressions shifted as they reviewed the evidence. Richard's face darkened with fury. "This is a desperate attempt to deflect from your obvious emotional instability," he snapped, losing his carefully maintained composure. "No," Richard Thomas replied calmly. "This is leadership. This is understanding that a company's value isn't just measured in quarterly profits, but in the lives it changes. Something you never understood." The meeting ended without a vote on Richard's motion, but the damage was done. Media outlets picked up the story, running headlines questioning Thomas's mental state and Emma's influence. The company's stock price fluctuated as investors tried to make sense of the conflict. Later that evening, in the quiet of his study, Thomas finally allowed his composure to crack. "He's right about one thing," he said to Emma, his voice heavy. "I have changed since you and Jake came into my life. But not because I'm unstable. Because for the first time since losing my family, I remember what it means to care about something beyond my grief." Emma stood steady in the face of his vulnerability. "Then we'll fight," she said simply. "We'll prove that healing isn't weakness, that finding new purpose doesn't dishonor old memories." Thomas looked up at her, seeing not just a caregiver but a partner in the battles ahead. "It won't be easy," he warned. "Richard won't stop. He'll try to destroy everything we've built." "Let him try," Emma replied, her voice firm. "Some things are worth fighting for." The wheelchair project designs lay spread across Thomas's desk, symbolizing both their challenges and their hope. The battle lines were drawn, but this time Thomas wouldn't face them alone. The aftermath of Richard's attack rippled through every aspect of their lives. Emma arrived at Jake's school one afternoon to find him in tears, clutching a crumpled newspaper. Other children had brought in articles about the Wheeler controversy, taunting Jake about his mother's role in the scandal. "Why are they saying mean things about Mr. Wheeler?" Jake asked that evening, his small voice trembling. "He's good. He helped me when I was sick." Emma held him close, struggling to explain adult complexities to a child's heart. The next morning, Jake refused to go to school, complaining of stomach aches that they both knew weren't real. Thomas noticed the changes in Jake during his visits to the estate. The boy's usual cheerful chatter dimmed, his drawings became darker, filled with storm clouds and angry figures. During one particularly difficult evening, Jake burst into tears during dinner. "I hate them for being mean to you," he sobbed, looking at Thomas. "You're like my dad now." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. Later that night, Emma found him in Michael's room, surrounded by old toys and memories. "I can't be his father," Thomas said quietly. "I failed at that once already. I can't fail him too." Emma's own exhaustion reached critical levels. Between managing Jake's school crisis, supporting Thomas through the company battles, and maintaining her caregiving duties, she barely slept. Dark circles formed under her eyes, and her hands shook when she thought no one was watching. The pressure began showing in small ways. Emma missed important medication times, mixed up therapy appointments, found herself crying in the estate's bathroom during brief breaks. Peggy noticed, bringing her tea and gentle suggestions to rest, but there was too much at stake to slow down. Thomas struggled with his own demons. The progress he'd made in therapy seemed to plateau, his body refusing to cooperate as stress took its toll. Dr. Miller watched with growing concern as Thomas pushed himself too hard, trying to prove Richard wrong through sheer force of will. "You're going to hurt yourself," Dr. Miller warned during one session, but Thomas wouldn't listen. "I can't show weakness now," he insisted, even as pain etched lines around his eyes. Richard's waiting for exactly that. The wheelchair project suffered as Thomas's attention was divided between corporate defense and development. Deadlines slipped, prototypes showed flaws, and investor interest began to waver. Each setback fed Richard's narrative about Thomas's instability. One night, after a particularly grueling board meeting, Emma found Thomas staring at old family photos. "Sometimes I wonder if Richard's right," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "Maybe I am trying to replace them. Maybe I'm not seeing clearly anymore." Emma sat beside him, her own exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "You're not replacing anyone," she said firmly. "You're learning to live again. There's a difference." But in the quiet hours of the night, she wondered if she'd crossed professional boundaries, if her presence in Thomas's life had somehow contributed to his current struggles. Jake's schoolwork began to suffer. His teacher sent notes home about his decreased participation, his withdrawal from friends. Emma scheduled meetings she was too tired to attend effectively, tried to help with homework she could barely focus on herself. The estate staff felt the strain. Peggy worked overtime trying to maintain order as Thomas's irregular schedule and Emma's exhaustion created chaos in the normally well-run household. Sarah's stress baked at all hours, filling the kitchen with untouched comfort foods. Even Dr. Miller began showing signs of frustration as therapy sessions became increasingly tense. The breaking point came during a rainy afternoon when Jake, visiting the estate after another difficult school day, asked a question that stopped everyone in their tracks. "If Mr. Wheeler loses his company, will we have to leave?" The innocent query exposed all their unspoken fears. Thomas wheeled himself away without answering, unable to face the possibility. Emma couldn't find words to reassure her son, and the silence that followed was deafening. That night, Emma sat alone in her small apartment after Jake had finally fallen asleep, surrounded by unpaid bills and school notices. The weight of everything: Jake's struggles, Thomas's battles, her own exhaustion seemed insurmountable. For the first time since starting at the estate, she wondered if she should walk away. But walking away would mean abandoning not just a job, but the complex web of relationships and hope they'd built. It would mean letting Richard win, letting grief reclaim Thomas, leaving Jake without the surrogate family he'd found. In his study at the estate, Thomas faced similar doubts. The wheelchair project designs lay abandoned on his desk, Catherine's foundation proposals gathered dust, and the sound of Jake's question echoed in his mind. The cost of fighting seemed too high, the risk of failure too great. Yet somehow they both knew that giving up wasn't an option. Not anymore. Not after coming so far. The wheelchair project, once a symbol of Thomas's renewal, began encountering serious obstacles. The first major setback, came when the initial prototype failed stress testing spectacularly, its frame buckling under conditions that should have been routine. The engineering team delivered the news during a video conference, their faces grim as they showed footage of the failure. "The lightweight materials we selected aren't providing the structural integrity we need," the lead engineer explained, sharing detailed analysis on the screen. "We'll need to completely redesign the base framework." The timeline implications were devastating, months of work essentially wasted, and the project's deadline rapidly approaching. Thomas sat in silence as the team outlined the problems, his face a mask of controlled frustration. Emma, standing nearby, could see his hands trembling slightly on the wheelchair's armrests. This wasn't just a technical failure, it was a personal one, threatening to validate Richard's claims about Thomas's judgment. The investor's response was swift and harsh. "We're concerned about the project's viability," one major backer wrote in an email that Thomas read aloud to Emma, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. "Given recent publicity about leadership stability, these technical issues raise serious doubts about continuing our involvement." The manufacturing partners began pulling back. Quotes for materials suddenly doubled, delivery timelines stretched impossibly long, and previously enthusiastic suppliers stopped returning calls. Richard's influence was obvious. He'd been busy behind the scenes, sowing doubts and creating obstacles. Dr. Miller tried to help by connecting them with rehabilitation specialists who could provide valuable input, but their feedback only complicated matters. Each expert had different requirements, different priorities, making it impossible to satisfy all needs while maintaining the project's core vision. One afternoon, during a particularly difficult design review, Thomas snapped. "This isn't working," he declared, sweeping prototype sketches off his desk in a burst of frustration. "We're trying to solve too many problems at once. Maybe Richard's right, maybe I'm not seeing things clearly anymore." Emma picked up the scattered papers, noting how the latest designs had become increasingly complex, trying to address every possible scenario. "We're losing sight of what made this special," she said quietly. It wasn't about creating the perfect wheelchair. It was about understanding what people really need. The project team's morale plummeted. Weekly progress meetings became exercises in damage control, with each department reporting new problems and missed targets. The enthusiasm that had characterized the early stages gave way to resignation and doubt. Jake, visiting the estate after school, noticed the change in atmosphere. "Why did you stop drawing new chairs?" he asked Thomas one day, looking at the abandoned sketches. "The old ones were boring. Yours were going to be cool." The simple observation hit home. They'd lost their way trying to meet everyone's expectations. Financial pressures mounted as development costs soared. The board, already skeptical thanks to Richard's influence, began questioning every expense. Each budget review became a battle, with Thomas defending not just the project but his entire vision for the company's future. The media caught wind of the technical failures, running stories that painted the project as a vanity exercise by an unstable executive. Wheeler's folly became a common headline, each article more damaging than the last. Richard's careful leaks ensured that every setback received maximum exposure. In the estate's workshop, where early prototypes gathered dust, Thomas spent long hours staring at the failed designs. "I thought I could make a difference," he confided to Emma during one late-night session. "I thought I could turn my disability into something positive, but look at this, nothing but wasted time and money." Emma watched him struggle with the weight of apparent failure. The project had been more than just a business venture, it had been his path back to purpose, his way of honoring Catherine and Michael's memory by helping others. Its collapse threatened to unravel all the progress he'd made. The staff felt the project's decline deeply. They'd invested emotionally in Thomas's vision, seeing it as part of his healing process. Each setback felt personal, each failure a step back toward the darkness they'd worked so hard to help him escape. Yet something unexpected emerged from the mounting failures. As the complex designs proved unworkable, Thomas began returning to his original sketches, simpler, more elegant solutions born from his own experience. The very obstacles that threatened to defeat them forced a return to the project's core purpose. "Maybe we need to fail," Emma suggested one evening, watching Thomas review the original concepts. "Maybe we need to strip everything away to see what really matters." Thomas looked up, meeting her gaze with dawning understanding. Sometimes she was learning. Setbacks weren't endings, they were opportunities to begin again, this time with clearer vision. The truth emerged on a rainy Tuesday evening when Peggy was organizing old files in the estate's archive room. Among dusty folders and forgotten documents, she found something that made her blood run cold: maintenance records for the helicopter, dated just days before the crash that had taken Catherine and Michael's lives. The records showed unauthorized modifications signed off by a maintenance supervisor who had mysteriously resigned shortly after the accident. More disturbing were the emails attached correspondence between Richard Blackwood and various parties discussing the helicopter's potential issues. In oddly specific terms. "Mr. Wheeler needs to see this," Peggy whispered, her hands trembling as she gathered the documents. But before she could leave the archive room, she heard footsteps approaching. Richard Blackwood himself appeared in the doorway, his usual polished smile replaced by something far darker. "Ah, Peggy," he said smoothly, stepping into the room. "Still loyal to my cousin after all these years." How touching, his eyes fixed on the papers in her hands. "Though I'm afraid your discovery is rather inconvenient." What followed was a tense confrontation. Richard revealed his long-harbored resentment, how he'd watched Thomas build the company while he remained in the shadows. The accident hadn't been meant to kill anyone, just disable the helicopter enough to shake Thomas's confidence, create doubt about his judgment. "A small mechanical failure," Richard explained, his voice chillingly casual. "Thomas would step down temporarily, I would step in. Simple, clean." But Catherine insisted on joining that flight. Michael wasn't even supposed to be there. His carefully maintained facade cracked, showing the bitterness beneath. Unknown to both, Emma had stayed late at the estate that evening, finishing paperwork. Hearing voices from the archive room, she approached quietly. Recording Richard's confession on her phone, she listened as he detailed his years of manipulation, his careful orchestration of Thomas's downfall. "The accident made things messier than planned," Richard continued, unaware of Emma's presence. "But Thomas's grief worked in my favor. His withdrawal, his depression, it all helped build the narrative of his instability. The wheelchair project was an unexpected complication, but even that's under control now." Peggy stood her ground, decades of loyalty to the Wheeler family evident in her rigid posture. "You won't get away with this," she stated firmly. "Thomas will learn the truth." Richard's laugh was cold. And who will believe him? The grieving, unstable widower, the man who can't even successfully design a wheelchair. He reached for the documents in Peggy's hands. "No, these records will disappear, just like the original maintenance logs." That's when Emma stepped in, her phone recording everything. "I believe the board will be very interested in hearing this conversation." Mr. Blackwood, the look of shock on Richard's face, was almost satisfying, if the situation hadn't been so tragic. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Security was called, lawyers contacted, and Thomas summoned from his study. Watching him absorb the truth about his family's deaths was heartbreaking. His face went through a range of emotions: disbelief, rage, devastating grief, and finally a terrible clarity. "All this time," Thomas said, his voice barely controlled, "while I blamed myself, while I drowned in guilt, it was you. My own family, the weight of betrayal hung heavy in the air." Richard, cornered and exposed, showed his true nature. Gone was the polished corporate facade, replaced by bitter resentment. "You had everything handed to you," he spat. "The company, the success, the perfect family. I deserve more than your shadow." As security escorted Richard from the estate, Emma noticed something extraordinary. Thomas, despite the devastating revelations, sat straighter in his wheelchair. The truth, however painful, had lifted a burden he'd carried for 2 years, the crushing guilt of believing he was responsible for his family's deaths. Peggy, still shaken, placed the maintenance records on Thomas's desk. "I always knew something wasn't right about that day," she said softly. "Catherine would never have boarded that helicopter if she'd had any doubts about its safety. She trusted you completely." Emma watched as Thomas absorbed this truth, saw how it began to reshape his understanding of the past 2 years. The grief remained, but the poisonous self-blame that had crippled him emotionally began to fade. "What happens now?" Emma asked quietly, after Peggy had left them alone. Thomas looked at the wheelchair project designs spread across his desk, then at the maintenance records that had revealed Richard's treachery. "Now," he said, his voice gaining strength, "we rebuild. Not just the project, but everything Richard tried to destroy, and we make sure he never hurts anyone else." The rain continued outside, but inside the estate something had shifted. The truth, though painful, had finally set them free to move forward. The aftermath of Richard's exposure brought unexpected challenges. While Thomas prepared for legal battles, Emma faced her own crisis. Richard's allies within the company began a targeted campaign against her, questioning her role in the discovery of the evidence and her motives for recording the confession. "It's too convenient," one board member suggested during an emergency meeting. "A caregiver just happens to be in the right place at the right time." The insinuation was clear. They believed Emma had been searching for dirt on Richard, perhaps even setting him up. The media caught wind of the story, but twisted it to fit their narrative. Headlines screamed about corporate espionage and manipulation. Emma's past financial struggles were dredged up, her relationship with Thomas scrutinized. Paparazzi began camping outside her apartment building, frightening Jake and disrupting their lives. "Mummy, why are those people taking pictures?" Jake asked one morning, peering through their apartment window. "Why do they keep saying mean things?" Emma held him close, trying to shield him from the harsh reality of their situation. School became increasingly difficult as other parents, reading the tabloid stories, began keeping their children away from Jake. Thomas watched helplessly as Emma and Jake paid the price for their loyalty. "You should take a leave of absence," he suggested one evening, his voice heavy with guilt. "Let things calm down. I can arrange for you to stay somewhere quiet, away from all this." But Emma refused to back down. "Running away won't solve anything," she said firmly. "They want us to break, to prove their theories right. We can't give them that satisfaction." Her determination was admirable, but Thomas could see the toll it was taking on her. Jake's health began showing signs of stress. His doctors noted elevated blood pressure during checkups, warning that the constant tension wasn't good for his heart. Emma spent sleepless nights watching him breathe, terrified that the stress would trigger another cardiac episode. The estate staff faced their own challenges. Those loyal to Richard had been deeply embedded in the household, and their sudden departure left gaps in critical operations. Peggy worked double shifts trying to maintain order, while remaining staff members faced hostile calls and emails from Richard's supporters. Thomas's legal team advised caution in public statements, leaving Emma to face the media storm alone. Each morning brought new accusations, new theories about her ulterior motives. Former colleagues from the diner were offered money for stories about her, leading to fabricated tales that painted her as an opportunist. The wheelchair project, despite its importance, had to be temporarily shelved as resources were diverted to the legal battle. Emma watched Thomas struggle with this necessity, knowing how much the project meant to his recovery. The prototype gathered dust in the workshop, a symbol of dreams deferred. One particularly difficult evening, after Jake had cried himself to sleep following another hard day at school, Emma found herself questioning everything. The weight of protecting her son while supporting Thomas seemed impossible to bear. She sat in their small kitchen, surrounded by unpaid bills and hostile newspaper clippings, feeling more alone than ever. Thomas, meanwhile, grappled with his own guilt. "I've dragged you both into this mess," he said during a quiet moment in his study. "Everything you're going through. It's because of me, because you tried to help me." The progress he'd made in therapy seemed to waver as he retreated into self-blame. Dr. Miller noticed the regression in Thomas's emotional state. "You're not responsible for Richard's actions," he reminded Thomas during a session, "and Emma made her own choice to stand by you. Don't dishonor that choice by assuming she can't handle the consequences." The estate itself seemed to reflect their struggles. Security had to be increased, turning the once welcoming grounds into a fortress. Windows were tinted for privacy, cameras installed at every entrance. The garden, Catherine's beloved sanctuary, became off-limits due to paparazzi trying to get photos through the fence. Jake's drawings, once bright and hopeful, turned darker. His art teacher called Emma, concerned about the themes of his work, pictures of people hiding from shadows, of cameras with sharp teeth, of a wheelchair alone in an empty room. The child psychologist suggested therapy, another expense they couldn't afford. Yet through it all, a strange kind of strength emerged. The very public attacks brought unexpected allies. Other Wheeler Innovations employees began speaking out, sharing stories of Richard's past manipulations. Former caregivers contacted Emma, offering support and corroborating her character. Sometimes Peggy told Emma during a rare quiet moment, "The cost of doing the right thing feels impossibly high. But that's what makes it matter." She squeezed Emma's hand. "You and Jake. You've given this house something it lost with Catherine and Michael. Hope. That's worth fighting for." The breaking point came on a stormy evening when Richard made his final desperate move. Having lost his corporate position and facing potential criminal charges, he arrived unannounced at the estate, somehow bypassing security. Emma found him in Thomas's study, the two cousins locked in a confrontation that had been building for years. "You took everything from me," Richard was saying, his polished exterior completely shattered. "The company should have been mine. I was the one who understood business, who knew how to lead. You were just playing with your inventions, pretending to be some kind of humanitarian hero." Thomas sat in his wheelchair, facing his cousin with a calmness that seemed to infuriate Richard further. "Is that what you told yourself when you sabotaged the helicopter?" Thomas asked quietly. "That you deserved it more than Catherine and Michael deserved to live?" The tension in the room was unbearable. Emma stood in the doorway, her phone already dialing security, watching Richard pace like a caged animal. His next words chilled her to the bone. "I have nothing left to lose," Richard declared, pulling out legal documents. "Sign over your voting shares now, or I'll make sure everyone knows about Jake's experimental heart surgery. How his mother let him be a test subject for unauthorized treatments. How the great Thomas Wheeler bought their silence with his charitable donation." Emma's heart stopped. The surgery that had saved Jake's life had indeed been experimental, though completely legal. But Richard's twisted version of events, combined with their current publicity, could trigger investigations that would tear their lives apart. Thomas's face went white with fury. "You would threaten a child? Your own family wasn't enough." His hands gripped the wheelchair arm so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Get out of my house, Richard. Whatever we were to each other died in that helicopter with Catherine and Michael." Instead of leaving, Richard moved closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Sign the papers, cousin, or watch your precious caregiver lose everything. Maybe even lose her son to child services. Is your pride worth that?" The moment hung suspended, heavy with possibility. Then Jake's voice cut through the tension. "Leave Mr. Wheeler alone." The boy stood in the doorway behind Emma, his small face fierce with protective anger. He must have followed Emma when she heard the commotion. Richard turned, startled by the interruption, and in that moment Thomas acted. He pressed a button on his wheelchair, activating the estate's new security system. Lights flashed, doors locked automatically, and within moments, security officers burst into the study. "I recorded everything," Emma said calmly, holding up her phone. "Every threat, every admission. It's already uploaded to my lawyer. She moved to stand beside Thomas's wheelchair, Jake joining them, the three of them presenting a united front. Richard's composure crumbled completely. "You don't understand," he ranted as security restrained him. "I was protecting the company." Thomas was weak, distracted by his perfect family, his charitable projects. I had to take control. As Richard was led away, something remarkable happened. Thomas reached out, taking Jake's hand in his left and Emma's in his right. The gesture said everything words couldn't. They were in this together, a family forged in adversity. Later that night, after Jake had finally fallen asleep on the study's couch, Emma and Thomas sat in exhausted silence. "I would have signed," Thomas admitted quietly. "To protect you and Jake, I would have given him everything." Emma shook her head. "That's why he never understood you, Thomas. He saw your capacity for love as weakness. He never realized it's your greatest strength." The storm outside began to ease, its fury spent. Inside the study, Thomas wheeled himself to the window, looking out at Catherine's garden. "For 2 years I've been haunted by what I lost," he said softly. "Tonight I finally understood what Catherine always told me, that family isn't just about blood. It's about choice, about who stands with you when everything falls apart." Emma stood beside him, watching the rain. "We choose to stay," she said simply. "Whatever comes next, we face it together." The breaking point had come and gone, leaving them not shattered but stronger. In threatening everything they cared about, Richard had inadvertently revealed the true strength of their bonds. The makeshift family that had formed in the shadow of tragedy stood firm, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The morning after Richard's arrest, the Wheeler estate awakened to an extraordinary sight. Dozens of employees from Wheeler Innovations had gathered outside the gates, carrying signs that read, "We stand with Thomas and family of Agreed." The spontaneous show of support marked the beginning of a remarkable community response. Sarah, the estate's cook, was the first to notice. "Mr. Wheeler," she called, her voice unusually emotional. "You need to see this." Thomas wheeled himself to the window, Emma at his side, and they watched as more people joined the gathering. Former patients who had benefited from Wheeler Innovations' medical programs, families helped by Catherine's foundation, even competitors who respected Thomas's ethical leadership. The company's employees shared stories on social media about Thomas's quiet acts of kindness over the years, paying for employees' children's education, ensuring medical coverage for families in crisis, maintaining salaries during economic downturns. Each story contradicted Richard's narrative of an unstable, self-absorbed leader. "He approved my emergency leave without question when my mother was sick," one department head told reporters, "then sent his personal doctor to consult on her case. That's the Thomas Wheeler we know." Similar testimonials flooded in, painting a picture of a leader who valued people over profits. Jake's school community rallied as well. Parents who had initially distanced themselves now came forward with support. His art teacher organized a special exhibition of children's drawings, featuring Jake's work alongside pieces depicting what family meant to each student. The showcase became a powerful statement about unconventional families and the bonds that transcend blood relations. The medical community, particularly those involved in Jake's surgery, released statements clarifying the legitimacy of the procedure. Dr. Sarah Marshall held a press conference explaining how Thomas's funding had advanced pediatric cardiac care, saving not just Jake but numerous other children. Mr. Wheeler's contribution wasn't just financial, Dr. Marshall emphasized. His insistence on developing more accessible medical technology has transformed how we treat young patients. Richard Blackwood's attempts to weaponize this against a child are despicable. Wheeler Innovations board members who had wavered under Richard's influence began publicly reaffirming their support for Thomas. The company's stock, which had dipped during the crisis, stabilized as investors responded to the overwhelming show of confidence in Thomas's leadership. Peggy coordinated with local community organizations to channel the public support effectively. The estate's gates, once a barrier, became a symbol of unity as people left notes, flowers, and drawings. Many messages specifically mentioned Emma and Jake, acknowledging their role in Thomas's recovery and their courage in facing Richard's threats. "Look, Mama," Jake exclaimed one morning, pointing to a group of children his age outside the gates. They had brought get well cards, remembering his recent health scare, and drawings of wheelchairs designed with the same imaginative spirit Thomas had shown in his project. The wheelchair project itself gained unexpected momentum. Engineers and designers from competing companies offered their expertise, seeing the value in Thomas's vision. Several major healthcare organizations expressed interest in funding the development, recognizing the potential impact on patients' lives. But local media outlets began running in-depth pieces about the estate's transformation. They interviewed staff members who described the changes they'd witnessed: Thomas's gradual emergence from grief, his renewed engagement with the company's humanitarian missions, the positive influence of Emma and Jake's presence. "This house was a mausoleum," Frank, the head of security, told one reporter. "Now it's becoming a home again. That's not instability, that's healing." The community's response affected Thomas deeply. Each morning he spent time reading the messages left at the gates, often with Jake beside him offering his own commentary. Emma noticed how these sessions seemed to strengthen him, replacing the weight of isolation with the warmth of connection. Even the garden began to reflect the change. Catherine's carefully planned flower beds, which had been maintained but not enhanced since her death, now received additions from well-wishers. Neighbors sent cuttings from their own gardens, creating new life in the space she had loved. Catherine would have loved this, Thomas said quietly one evening, watching children from neighboring houses leave drawings at the gate. She always said a home should be open to love, to possibility. His voice carried not just grief now, but gratitude. The estate staff organized a thank you event, setting up refreshments near the gates for the supporters who continued to gather. The simple gesture turned into an impromptu community celebration, with Thomas, Emma, and Jake at its heart. "You see," Emma said to Thomas as they watched Jake interact with other children, his confidence restored by their acceptance. "We're not alone in this. We never were." Thomas squeezed her hand in response, understanding that their makeshift family had grown far beyond the estate's walls. The full extent of Richard's deception unraveled like a carefully woven tapestry coming undone. In the days following his arrest, investigators uncovered a trail of manipulation that stretched back years before the helicopter accident. Each revelation brought new waves of shock and understanding. Thomas sat in his study, surrounded by files that detailed his cousin's systematic betrayal. Financial records showed how Richard had been quietly undermining Wheeler Innovations from within, setting up shadow companies to siphon funds, manipulating reports to create the illusion of instability. But it was the personal betrayals that cut deepest. "He altered Catherine's foundation documents," Peggy explained, her voice trembling with anger as she showed Thomas the evidence. The programs that were shut down after the accident, he had already begun dismantling them months before, using your signature from other documents. Emma watched as Thomas absorbed each new piece of information. The maintenance logs for the helicopter revealed a calculated plan, small adjustments, seemingly routine changes, all designed to create just enough doubt about Thomas's judgment without pointing to deliberate sabotage. "Look at these dates," Thomas said quietly, spreading out the records. The day Catherine decided to join the flight. Richard had been in the maintenance hangar that morning. His hands shook as he pointed to the signature log. He knew she would be there. He knew Michael had asked to come along. The investigation uncovered emails between Richard and certain board members, carefully orchestrating Thomas's isolation after the accident. "Keep him focused on his grief," one message advised. "The more he withdraws, the easier our work becomes." The calculated cruelty of it stunned everyone. Jake, with a child's instinctive understanding, brought Thomas a drawing one afternoon. It showed two houses, one dark and full of shadows, labeled before, and one bright and colorful, labeled now. "The bad man tried to keep you in the dark house," he explained solemnly, "but we helped you find the light one." Former employees came forward with their own stories. Richard's network of influence had extended throughout the company, rewarding those who supported his narrative about Thomas's instability and punishing those who remained loyal. The pattern of intimidation and manipulation was staggering. "I should have seen it," Thomas said one evening, after reviewing another set of damning documents. "All those years he was right beside me, smiling, playing the supportive cousin while he plotted." Emma touched his shoulder gently. "You saw what family should be," she replied. He took advantage of that trust. The media coverage shifted dramatically as the truth emerged. Headlines that had once questioned Thomas's stability now detailed Richard's calculated destruction of both the company and his own family. Reporters who had publicized Richard's accusations now investigated his long history of manipulation. Legal teams discovered that Richard had even tried to access Michael's trust fund, attempting to gain control of the portion of the company set aside for Thomas's son. The documentation showed how he had planned to use Thomas's grief-stricken withdrawal from business as grounds for financial guardianship. Perhaps most shocking was the revelation about Catherine's foundation work. Richard had systematically undermined her healthcare initiatives, redirecting funds and sabotaging programs while maintaining a facade of support. He couldn't stand that she saw through him, Peggy remembered. Catherine never trusted him, but she kept peace for the family's sake. The investigation reached into every corner of the Wheeler empire, revealing how Richard had positioned himself to take control long before the accident. His patience and calculation were chilling years of careful manipulation, all while playing the role of devoted cousin. As each truth came to light, Thomas's own healing accelerated. The guilt he'd carried, the doubt that had plagued him, began to lift. "I wasn't crazy," he said to Emma, his voice rough with emotion. "All those times I felt something was wrong, when decisions didn't make sense. I wasn't imagining it." The wheelchair project files revealed another layer of sabotage. Richard had been secretly contacting suppliers, discouraging them from working with Wheeler Innovations, creating the technical obstacles that had nearly derailed the project. Even in this, he had tried to destroy Thomas's path to recovery. Jake, witnessing the adults processing these revelations, offered his simple wisdom. "Bad people try to make good people feel bad," he said during dinner one evening. "But they can't win if we stick together." His words, innocent yet profound, brought tears to both Emma and Thomas's eyes. The truth had emerged, but it wasn't just about exposing Richard's crimes. It was about validating Thomas's instincts, confirming Emma's faith in him, and proving that their unconventional family bond had been strong enough to withstand a carefully orchestrated assault. In the end, Richard's greatest miscalculation had been underestimating the power of genuine love and loyalty. Victory came not in grand gestures, but in small, profound moments. The first was when Thomas wheeled himself into Michael's room, unopened since the accident, with Emma and Jake beside him. Instead of drowning in grief, he began to share stories: Michael's first science project, his love of model airplanes, his infectious laugh. "He would have liked you," Jake Thomas said, watching the boy examine Michael's collection of robots. "He always wanted a brother." The words came naturally, without the crushing pain that had previously accompanied any mention of his son. Jake looked up, his face bright with understanding. Can I keep one of his robots? To remember him by." Thomas's hand trembled as he reached for one of Michael's favorite pieces. "He would want you to have it," he said softly. It was a breakthrough moment, the first time he'd been able to share Michael's memory instead of guarding it in solitary grief. The wheelchair project resumed with renewed energy, but with a significant change. Thomas invited Jake to join the design meetings, valuing his uninhibited creativity. "Why does it have to look medical?" Jake asked one day. "Why can't it be cool?" His question led to a complete rethinking of the aesthetic approach, making the design more appealing to younger users. Emma watched as Thomas gradually reclaimed his role as a leader, but with a new dimension of empathy and understanding. During company meetings, he began sharing personal experiences about accessibility challenges, turning his disability into a source of insight, rather than shame. The estate itself began to transform. Thomas asked Emma and Jake to help redesign some of the spaces, making them more welcoming and lived in. Catherine's garden became a place of joy again, with Jake planting sunflowers alongside the carefully maintained roses. Mom would have loved this mix, Thomas said, watching the unlikely combination flourish. One particularly meaningful victory came during a physical therapy session. Dr. Miller had been working with Thomas on a challenging new exercise when Jake spontaneously started cheering from the doorway. Instead of his usual self-consciousness about his limitations, Thomas laughed and pushed harder, drawing strength from the boy's enthusiasm. "Remember when you couldn't even look at old photos?" Emma asked one evening, as they sorted through family albums together. Thomas nodded, his fingers tracing a picture of Catherine. "Now they remind me of love instead of loss," he replied. "That's because of you both. You showed me it's possible to honor the past while building a future." The staff noticed the changes too. Thomas began joining them for meals regularly, sharing stories and asking about their families. The formal barriers that grief had erected began to dissolve, replaced by genuine connections. Even Sarah, the once stern cook, was caught dancing in the kitchen with Jake while baking cookies. Perhaps the most significant victory came unexpectedly. During a board meeting presentation about the wheelchair project, Thomas suddenly stopped mid-sentence, overcome with emotion. Instead of retreating as he once would have, he shared honestly about his journey from despair to purpose, earning a standing ovation from the same board members who had once doubted him. Jake's role in their victory was undeniable. His innocent acceptance of Thomas's disability, his endless questions about the wheelchair designs, his way of treating the estate as home all contributed to healing what Richard had tried to destroy. "You're not broken," Jake told Thomas matter-of-factly one day. "You're just different, like how my heart is different. And different is good." Emma found her own victories in unexpected places. The confidence she'd gained standing up to Richard transformed her approach to challenges. She began taking online courses in project management, contributing more directly to the wheelchair project's development. Thomas supported her growth, recognizing that her strength had helped him find his own. The final piece fell into place when Thomas received a letter from Catherine's parents. They had been watching the news about Richard's betrayal and Thomas's recovery. "We see our daughter's spirit in how you've rebuilt," they wrote. "Not just the company, but your capacity to love. She would be so proud of the family you found." That evening, Thomas called a small gathering in the study, just Emma, Jake, Peggy, and Dr. Miller. "I want to thank you," he said, his voice steady with new strength. "Each of you saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. You didn't just help me survive, you helped me learn to live again." Jake, in his simple wisdom, summed up their victory best. Looking at a new family photo they'd taken in the garden, he said, "See? The sad is still there, but now there's happy too. That's what winning looks like." The transformation of Wheeler Innovations began with a simple memo from Thomas to all employees: "We're not just rebuilding a company, we're redefining its soul." The corporate restructuring that followed was unlike anything Wall Street had seen. In the main boardroom, Thomas presented his vision for the company's future, his wheelchair positioned at the head of the table with quiet confidence. Wheeler Innovations was founded on the principle of improving lives, he began. "It's time we return to that mission, but with deeper understanding of what it truly means." The first major change was the revival and expansion of Catherine's foundation, now renamed the Catherine and Michael Wheeler Foundation for Accessible Healthcare. Emma, drawing from her experiences with Jake's medical journey, was appointed to the foundation's advisory board, bringing a parent's perspective to their initiatives. "Our son's legacy will be one of helping others," Thomas announced at the foundation's relaunch event. "Catherine always said that privilege comes with responsibility. It's time we fully embraced that philosophy." The Foundation's first project was establishing a support network for families navigating complex medical care systems. The wheelchair project evolved into a full division focused on adaptive technology. Thomas insisted on including users in every stage of development, creating a design panel that represented diverse needs and experiences. Jake's original suggestion about making the wheelchairs cool became a cornerstone of their design philosophy. Corporate culture shifted dramatically. Richard's network of influence was dismantled, replaced by a transparent leadership structure that emphasized ethical decision-making. Thomas instituted a revolutionary policy: every executive was required to spend time with the people their products served, understanding their challenges firsthand. Wheeler Innovations' stock value soared as investors recognized the authenticity of the company's new direction. "This isn't corporate social responsibility as a marketing strategy," one analyst noted. "This is genuine transformation driven by lived experience." The board underwent significant changes. Several members who had supported Richard resigned, replaced by individuals who shared Thomas's vision for ethical innovation. Among the new appointees was Dr. Sarah Marshall, bringing her medical expertise and understanding of patient needs to corporate decisions. Employee morale reached new heights as Thomas implemented policies that reflected his personal journey. The company established comprehensive support systems for employees facing family health crises, inspired by both his own loss and Emma's struggles as a single parent. The legal aftermath of Richard's actions was handled with characteristic grace. Rather than pursuing punitive damages, Thomas directed the company's legal team to focus on recovery and reform. "We'll measure our success not by what we gain," he told the shareholders, "but by what we give back." Innovation flourished in this new environment. The engineering team, freed from Richard's interference, began developing groundbreaking solutions for accessibility challenges. Each project was guided by Thomas's insistence on understanding the human story behind the technical specifications. Remember, he often told his development teams, "We're not just solving engineering problems. We're helping people write their own stories of independence and dignity." This philosophy became known as the Wheeler Principle in the industry. Peggy, whose loyalty had helped expose Richard's betrayal, was promoted to Chief of Staff, formalizing the influence she had always held within the company. Her first initiative was establishing a mentorship program connecting experienced employees with newcomers, building the kind of support system she had provided for years. The company's headquarters underwent physical transformation as well. The imposing security measures installed during Richard's campaign of intimidation were replaced with thoughtfully designed accessible spaces. The lobby now featured an interactive display of success stories, real people whose lives had been improved by Wheeler Innovations' work. Perhaps most significantly, Thomas established a unique position within the company Chief Empathy Officer. The role, first offered to Emma in recognition of her insight and compassion, was designed to ensure that human experience remained at the center of every corporate decision. International expansion followed, but with a distinctive approach. Rather than focusing solely on profitable markets, Wheeler Innovations prioritized regions with the greatest need for accessible technology. "Profit will follow purpose," Thomas assured skeptical investors. Time proved him right. The company's annual report, traditionally a dry document of numbers and projections, now included a human impact statement measuring success in lives improved rather than just dollars earned. This innovative approach to corporate reporting soon became an industry standard. By year's end, Wheeler Innovations had been completely transformed. The company that Richard had tried to twist into a mere profit machine had become something unprecedented: a corporation with a conscience, guided by personal experience and dedicated to genuine human improvement. "You've built something remarkable," Emma told Thomas one evening, reviewing the latest project proposals. "Something that honors both what you lost and what you found." Thomas smiled, watching Jake demonstrate the latest wheelchair prototype to visiting investors. "No," he corrected gently, "we built this, all of us together." The true measure of healing revealed itself in quiet moments at the Wheeler estate. One sunny morning, Thomas asked Emma and Jake to help him with a task he'd been avoiding for 2 years: organizing Michael's room. Instead of the dreaded ordeal it might have been, the day became a celebration of memories. "Dad, look what I found," Jake called out, the word "Dad" slipping naturally from his lips for the first time. He held up one of Michael's old science fair medals. Thomas froze momentarily, then smiled, tears gathering in his eyes. "Come here, son," he said softly, opening his arms. "Let me tell you about the volcano experiment that won that medal." Emma watched from the doorway as Thomas and Jake sorted through Michael's belongings, deciding what to preserve and what to share with other children who might need them. Each item sparked a story, and through the telling, Thomas's grief began to transform into something softer, more bittersweet than painful. The changes extended throughout the estate. Catherine's study, which had remained locked since the accident, was reopened and repurposed as a family room. Her books still lined the shelves, but now they shared space with Jake's artwork and Emma's family photos. The room became a bridge between past and present. Thomas's therapy sessions with Dr. Miller took on a different tone. Instead of focusing solely on physical rehabilitation, they began discussing future plans. "I never thought I'd say this," Thomas admitted during one session, "but I'm actually looking forward to tomorrow. Each day brings something new to discover." The nightmares that had plagued Thomas began to fade. When they did come, he no longer faced them alone. Often he'd find Jake in the kitchen at midnight, insisting on making hot chocolate, because that's what Mum does when I have bad dreams. These late-night conversations became precious moments of bonding. Emma's own healing paralleled Thomas's. The constant stress of single parenthood eased as she found herself part of a larger family unit. The estate staff, once formal and distant, became extended family. Sarah taught Jake to bake Catherine's favorite cookies, while Peggy shared stories of Thomas's early days building the company. The garden underwent its own transformation. Rather than maintaining it exactly as Catherine had left it, they began adding their own touches. Jake's vegetable patch flourished beside Catherine's roses, while Emma's herb garden added new fragrances to the air. "We're not erasing her vision," Thomas explained to the gardeners. "We're helping it grow." Physical barriers around the estate came down one by one. The security cameras that Richard's threats had necessitated were reduced. Windows were unwashed of their protective tinting. The gates, once permanently closed, now opened regularly for community events and family gatherings. During one such gathering, Thomas surprised everyone by suggesting they watch home videos of Catherine and Michael. Instead of the painful experience it once would have been, the evening became a joyous sharing of memories. Jake asked questions about his brother in heaven while Emma held Thomas's hand through both laughter and tears. The wheelchair project played its own role in healing. Thomas began seeing his disability not as a punishment or reminder of loss, but as a way to understand and help others. He and Jake spent hours testing prototypes together, their shared enthusiasm healing old wounds through purpose. Emma's apartment in Queens, once a symbol of her struggles, was finally cleared out. Moving into the estate happened gradually, with each box unpacked representing another step toward their new reality. Jake's toys mingled with Michael's treasured possessions, creating a space that honored both past and present. The most profound healing came in unexpected moments, like when Thomas, helping Jake with his math homework, suddenly realized he was using the same patient tone Catherine had used with Michael, or when Emma found herself humming Catherine's favorite lullaby to Jake, taught to her by Peggy. "Do you think they'd be happy for us?" Thomas asked Emma one evening, watching Jake play in the garden. Catherine and Emma considered the question carefully. "I think they'd want you to be loved," she replied. "And you are, so very much." Dr. Miller noted in his final therapy report that Thomas's recovery had exceeded all expectations. "The physical healing was important," he wrote, "but the emotional transformation is remarkable." He's not just surviving now, he's thriving. But the estate itself seemed to reflect this healing. Rooms that had been shrouded in darkness now filled with light. The sound of laughter, once so rare, became common. Even the staff moved with lighter steps, as if the healing extended to everyone who entered the gates. Spring arrived at the Wheeler estate with unprecedented promise. Thomas had arranged a special surprise for Emma's birthday legal adoption papers for Jake, waiting on his desk alongside architectural plans for renovating the East Wing into a proper family space. "We've been a family in all but name," Thomas said, watching Emma's eyes fill with tears as she read the documents. "It's time to make it official." Jake, who had been in on the secret, bounced with excitement. "Does this mean I can call you Dad all the time now?" he asked, making both adults laugh through their tears. The adoption ceremony was held in Catherine's garden, with Peggy serving as witness. As Jake officially became a Wheeler, butterflies danced around the roses, a sight that the staff viewed as Catherine's blessing. Thomas's hands trembled as he signed the papers, not from weakness but from joy. The East Wing renovation became a family project. Jake insisted on designing his own room, a creative blend of Michael's old space and his own personality. Thomas and Emma worked together to create a master suite that accommodated Thomas's needs while maintaining the warmth of a family home. "Look what I found," Jake called one afternoon during the renovation, holding up an old photograph that had slipped behind a drawer. It showed Catherine and Michael planting the first roses in the garden. Instead of hiding it away, Thomas asked for it to be framed and hung in their new family room. The estate staff embraced these changes wholeheartedly. Sarah expanded her menu to include Jake's favorites alongside traditional Wheeler family recipes. Peggy reorganized the household schedules to accommodate their new family routines, including regular movie nights and Sunday brunches in the garden. Professional life evolved to match their personal happiness. Thomas adjusted company policies to better support working parents, with Emma's experiences helping shape the changes. The wheelchair project expanded to include a children's line, inspired by Jake's input and designed to help young users feel empowered rather than different. Emma's role at Wheeler Innovations grew beyond caregiving. Her natural empathy and organizational skills made her invaluable in patient advocacy and product development. Thomas watched with pride as she presented her ideas at board meetings, her confidence growing with each success. The Foundation's work took on new meaning as they worked together. Jake often accompanied them to children's hospitals, his own experience helping him connect with young patients. Thomas found himself sharing not just resources but hope, showing families that challenges could become stepping stones to unexpected joy. Their evenings developed a comfortable rhythm. Homework at the kitchen table, with Thomas helping Jake with math while Emma prepared dinner. Family meetings in the study, where Jake's crayon drawings hung beside corporate awards. Weekend adventures exploring the estate grounds, Thomas's wheelchair no longer a limitation but simply part of their journey together. One evening, as they watched the sunset from Catherine's garden, Jake asked a question that touched them all deeply. "Do you think Michael would like having me as his brother?" Thomas pulled him close, sharing a look with Emma over their son's head. "He would love it," Thomas assured him, "just like we do." The legal proceedings against Richard concluded quietly, but brought an unexpected gift. In searching through old records, they discovered a series of letters Catherine had written about her hopes for the foundation. These became the blueprint for its future direction, allowing her vision to live on through their work. Community involvement became a family priority. The estate hosted regular events for children with disabilities, turning the once private grounds into a place of healing for others. Jake proudly showed visitors his father's prototype wheelchairs, explaining features with growing expertise. Emma's small apartment in Queens was transformed into a transition home for families dealing with medical crises, the first of many such facilities the foundation would establish. "Full circle," she remarked to Thomas, standing in the renovated space. From struggling alone to helping others find support. Their story began attracting attention beyond the business world. Other families facing similar challenges sought their advice and support. Thomas and Emma found themselves becoming advocates for non-traditional families, showing how love could bridge any gap. The greatest testament to their new beginning came from Jake's art teacher, who shared a recent family portrait he'd drawn. It showed all of them together, Thomas in his wheelchair, Emma beside him, Jake between them, but also included subtle butterflies representing Catherine and Michael, watching over them with love. Family isn't about replacing what was lost, Thomas reflected, looking at Jake's drawing. It's about growing something new from strong roots. Emma squeezed his hand, understanding that their new beginning honored the past while embracing the future. The launch of the Wheeler adaptive technology line transformed from a corporate event into a celebration of triumph over adversity. The grand ballroom of Wheeler Innovations headquarters buzzed with anticipation as Thomas wheeled onto the stage, Emma and Jake flanking him with proud smiles. 2 years ago, Thomas began, his voice steady and strong. I saw my wheelchair as a symbol of loss. Today, with the help of my family, I see it as a bridge to understanding and innovation. The audience, filled with medical professionals, investors, and families from the foundation, listened intently. Jake, dressed in a miniature suit that matched his father's, took the microphone with surprising confidence. My dad and I tested every design, he announced, making the crowd chuckle. And I made them add colors because wheelchairs should be fun. Thomas beamed at his son, remembering how that simple suggestion had revolutionized their approach. The presentation revealed not just technical innovations, but a complete reimagining of adaptive technology. The first model rolled onto stage sleek, customizable, and incorporating all the insights gained from Thomas's personal experience. But it was the children's line that stole the show, with bright colors and interchangeable panels designed to grow with young users. Emma presented the accessibility programs that would accompany the product launch. This isn't just about selling wheelchairs, she explained. It's about creating a support system for families facing similar challenges. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had walked both sides of the journey, from struggling single mother to advocate for change. The moment that brought tears to many eyes came when a group of children, all users of the prototype chairs, joined them on stage. Among them was a young girl whose story paralleled Michael's. She had the same kind of heart condition he had faced as a child. She rolled up to Thomas in one of the new chairs, presenting him with a hand-drawn card. "Mr. Wheeler," she said clearly into the microphone, "thank you for making chairs that help us fly." The phrase echoed Catherine's words from years ago, when she had encouraged Thomas to use his engineering skills to help others soar. The synchronicity wasn't lost on anyone who knew the family story. The technical presentation impressed investors and medical professionals alike. The chairs incorporated breakthrough features in weight distribution, energy efficiency, and customization options. But it was the human element that truly set them apart, each innovation born from real understanding of users' needs. Jake proudly demonstrated the children's model, showing how easily it could be adjusted and personalized. "See," he explained to the audience, "the controls are like a video game, so kids can learn faster." His natural enthusiasm perfectly illustrated the project's core philosophy that adaptive technology should empower, not limit. Media coverage focused not just on the technical achievements, but on the remarkable family story behind them. Photos of Thomas working with Jake on prototypes, Emma conducting user interviews, and the three of them testing designs in Catherine's garden captured public imagination. The foundation's involvement ensured that the technology would reach those who needed it most. Thomas announced a program to subsidize chairs for families facing financial hardships, naming it after Michael. "Every child deserves the chance to move freely," he declared, his voice thick with emotion. Orders began pouring in before the presentation ended. Hospitals, rehabilitation centers, and individual families all wanted to be part of this revolution in adaptive technology. But Thomas insisted that each order be handled personally, maintaining the human connection that made their approach unique. Emma watched Thomas interact with families after the presentation, noting how naturally he connected with both parents and children. His wheelchair was no longer a barrier but a bridge, allowing him to meet others exactly where they were in their journey. The launch party that evening became a celebration of community. Staff members who had supported the project from its difficult beginnings mingled with families who would benefit from its success. Jake moved through the crowd like a young ambassador, sharing stories and making everyone feel welcome. Thomas found a quiet moment to wheel into Catherine's garden, now visible from the ballroom through glass doors. Emma followed, carrying 2 glasses of champagne. "We did it," she said softly, handing him a glass. "No," he replied, taking her hand. "We did so much more. We found our way home." Inside, Jake was showing another child how to do wheelchair donuts safely, both of them laughing as they spun in circles. The sight captured everything the project represented: joy, freedom, and the unbreakable bonds of family, both given and chosen. The evening of the project launch, after the celebrations had wound down and Jake was asleep in his new room, Thomas and Emma found themselves in Catherine's garden. The moonlight cast soft shadows through the rose bushes, and the air was heavy with possibility. "There's something I need to say," Thomas began, his wheelchair positioned beside the stone bench where Emma sat. "Something I've been trying to find the right words for." His hands gripped the armrests tightly, betraying his nervousness despite all they'd been through together. "When I lost Catherine and Michael, I thought that was the end of my story. I built walls around my heart, convinced that loving again would somehow dishonor their memory." He paused, looking up at the stars. "But you and Jake, you didn't break down those walls. You showed me how to build windows instead, how to let light back in while still keeping their memory safe." Emma listened quietly, her heart pounding. She thought of their journey from those first tense days of caregiving to this moment, how their relationship had evolved through crisis and triumph, through tears and laughter. "The adoption papers for Jake were just the beginning," Thomas continued. "I find myself wanting more, dreaming of a future I never thought I'd deserve again." From his jacket pocket, he pulled out a small velvet box. "Catherine once told me that love multiplies, it doesn't divide. That there's always room for more if we're brave enough to open our hearts." Tears filled Emma's eyes as Thomas opened the box, revealing a ring that somehow managed to honor the past while embracing the future, a family heirloom redesigned with modern touches. "I'm not asking you to replace anyone," he said softly. "I'm asking you to help me write the next chapter of our story." Before Emma could respond, they heard small footsteps. Jake stood in the garden doorway, clutching his favorite robot, the one that had been Michael's. "Did you ask her yet?" he whispered loudly, making both adults laugh through their tears. "I helped pick the ring." "Come here, sweetheart," Emma called, opening her arms. Jake ran to them, completing their circle. "Your dad was just asking a very important question." She turned back to Thomas, her eyes shining. "And my answer is yes. Yes to all of it, to us, to our family, to our future." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of joyful preparation. The estate staff, who had watched their relationship bloom, threw themselves into wedding preparations with enthusiasm. Sarah began testing reception menus, while Peggy coordinated with the foundation to ensure the ceremony would be accessible for all guests. They decided to hold the ceremony in the garden, where their journey had truly begun. Jake took his role as best man seriously, practicing his speech with anyone who would listen. "I'm getting a real family," he told Dr. Miller during a checkup. "Not that we weren't one before, but now everybody will know it." The wedding plans reflected their unique family dynamic. Catherine's parents were invited and welcomed warmly, understanding that their presence celebrated rather than overshadowed the joy of new beginnings. A photo of Catherine and Michael would stand on a special table, acknowledging that love can embrace both memory and future. Emma's wedding dress incorporated subtle butterflies in its design, a nod to the creatures that had become symbols of hope and transformation in their lives. Thomas had his wheelchair customized for the occasion, with Jake's artistic input making it part of the celebration rather than a limitation. The estate underwent its final transformation from mansion to home. The East Wing renovation completed just in time, creating spaces that worked for all of them. Jake's room connected to a small study filled with both Michael's old books and new adventures waiting to be read. One evening, as they reviewed seating arrangements in the study, Jake presented them with a drawing. It showed their family tree, but with a unique perspective, roots deep in the past nourishing new growth, with butterflies fluttering between the branches connecting everyone together. "See," he explained proudly, "that's Michael and Catherine up there, watching over us. And here we are down here, growing new branches. It's like Dad said, love multiplies." Thomas pulled his son close, sharing a look with Emma that contained volumes of understanding. The staff noticed how the estate itself seemed to brighten as the wedding approached. The gardens bloomed with unprecedented vigor, as if nature itself celebrated their union. Even Thomas's therapy sessions took on new energy as he worked toward his goal of standing for parts of the ceremony. Through it all, their commitment to the foundation and wheelchair project remained strong. They were building not just a family, but a legacy of hope and innovation that would help other families face their own challenges. "You know what makes me happiest?" Jake asked one night at dinner. "That we're not erasing anyone. We're just making our circle bigger out of the mouths of babes." Emma thought came the perfect description of their unique and beautiful family formation. 1 year after the wedding, the Wheeler estate buzzed with activity as they prepared for their annual foundation gala. The garden, now a harmonious blend of Catherine's original design and new additions, provided the perfect setting for reflection on how far they'd come. Thomas sat in his study, now transformed into a family space where Jake's homework shared desk space with corporate documents and Emma's foundation proposals. A new photograph held pride of place beside the ones of Catherine and Michael their wedding day, with Jake between them, all three laughing as butterflies released for the ceremony swirled around them. "Dad!" Jake's voice echoed through the halls. The first shipment of kid wheelchairs arrived at the hospital. His excitement was infectious as he bounded into the study, clutching pictures from the delivery. The children's ward at Queen's General, where Jake had once been a patient, was now a flagship center for the Wheeler Adaptive Technology Program. Emma followed more sedately, her hand resting lightly on her growing baby bump. The news of her pregnancy had brought happy tears and celebration to the entire household. "Your brother or sister is doing somersaults today," she told Jake with a smile. "You must be excited about the delivery, too." The foundation had exceeded all expectations. Catherine's vision of accessible healthcare had expanded beyond anything they'd imagined, now helping thousands of families navigate medical challenges. The original donation that had saved Jake's life had multiplied into a network of support spanning the country. Peggy, now officially Grandma Peggy to Jake, maintained her efficient oversight of the estate while spoiling him shamelessly. Sarah's kitchen constantly filled the house with amazing smells, and the staff had truly become extended family, each playing their part in the Wheelers' unique story. The wheelchair project had revolutionized the industry. Thomas's designs, influenced by both his personal experience and Jake's creative input, were changing lives worldwide. More importantly, they'd changed how people viewed adaptive technology not as a limitation, but as a bridge to independence. Their evening routine had evolved into something both ordinary and precious. Family dinners were lively affairs, with Jake sharing school stories and Thomas discussing foundation projects. Emma's quick wit kept them all laughing, while underneath the table, her foot would often rest against Thomas's wheelchair, a subtle reminder of their connection. Catherine's parents became regular visitors, finding joy in Jake's enthusiasm and Emma's warmth. They brought old family photos and stories, helping Jake understand the full legacy he carried. "You have your brother's smile," Catherine's mother told him one day, "and your father's heart for helping others." The East Wing, once a shrine to grief, now echoed with life. Jake's room featured a wall of photos, Michael and Catherine on one side, his new family on the other, with plenty of space in the middle for future memories. The nursery next door waited expectantly, its walls painted with scenes from children's books that both Wheeler boys had loved. Thomas had exceeded Dr. Miller's expectations in his physical therapy. While he would always need the wheelchair, his strength and independence had grown tremendously. He often joked that chasing after Jake was the best therapy he could ask for. Emma's role at Wheeler Innovations had evolved into something uniquely powerful. Her experience as both a struggling single mother and now part of the Wheeler family gave her invaluable perspective in guiding the foundation's work. Her office wall featured letters from families they'd helped, each one a reminder of why their work mattered. One evening, as sunset painted the garden in golden light, they gathered on the patio for their nightly tradition. Jake worked on homework while Thomas reviewed foundation proposals and Emma sketched nursery designs. The comfortable silence was broken by Jake's thoughtful voice. "You know what I learned in school today," he said, looking up from his books. "That butterflies can fly thousands of miles to find their way home. Just like us, we all had to fly a long way, but we found where we belong." Thomas reached for Emma's hand, while his other arm wrapped around Jake. The baby kicked, as if adding agreement to Jake's observation. Above them, butterflies danced through Catherine's roses, a reminder that love never truly dies, it just transforms, taking flight in new and unexpected ways. The Wheeler estate, once a monument to loss, had become a testament to love's ability to heal and grow. Their story, born from tragedy and triumph, continued to inspire others facing their own challenges. But more than that, it proved that family isn't defined by blood or circumstance, but by the courage to open hearts to new possibilities. As night fell and stars appeared, their light reflected off the wheelchair that had once seemed like a prison, but now represented freedom and purpose. The Wheeler family, past, present, and future, were home, their circle complete, yet always ready to expand with more love. What touched you most about the Wheeler family's journey? From Thomas's path through grief to Jake's innocent wisdom, or Emma's unwavering strength, each character brings a unique perspective on love, healing, and the true meaning of family. Share your thoughts in the comments below and tell us which moment resonated most with your heart. If you enjoyed this story of hope and second chances, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. We bring you meaningful stories that celebrate the human spirit and remind us that even in our darkest moments, love can light the way forward. Feel this story could touch someone else's life? Share it with friends and family. Every share helps spread a message of hope, healing, and the beautiful truth that family isn't limited by blood, it's boundless when measured by love. Together we can remind others that second chances and new beginnings are always possible.